The moon hung like a pale and blinking eye over the Wyoming wilderness. Its cold light washed over the barren landscape, illuminating the horror that no human was meant to witness. A young woman's face protruded from the hard-packed earth like some grotesque sculpture half completed. Only her head remained above ground, her dark hair splayed around her dirt-encrusted face. Her eyes wide open and glassy stared upward at the vast canvas of stars that sparkled with cold indifference to her suffering. Emma Blackwood's cracked lips parted slightly as she struggled to draw another shallow breath. How long had she been here? Hours, days' time had lost all meaning in this living nightmare. The earth pressed against her chest, restricting her lungs, making each breath a battle she was slowly losing. In the distance, a wolf howled a mournful cry that seemed to herald death's approach. High above, an eagle circled lazily as if waiting for nature to take its course. Emma's vision blurred as consciousness began to slip away. The stars above started to dim one by one like candles being extinguished. Is this how it ends? She thought as darkness crept in from the edges of her mind. A single tear cut a clean path through the dirt on her cheek, the last moisture her dehydrated body could spare. As her eyelids grew heavy, Emma thought she heard something, a sound foreign to the natural chorus of the wilderness. Footsteps, a voice, perhaps it was just her mind, offering one final comfort before the end. The darkness claimed her. Mason Caldwell drove the fence post deeper into the unforgiving Wyoming soil, each strike of his hammer echoing across the empty landscape. Sweat trickled down his weathered face despite the cool morning air soaking into his salt and pepper beard. At 52, every movement reminded him that he was no longer the man he once was. His cabin stood 100 yards away, a simple wooden structure that seemed to grow from the land itself. Smoke curled from the chimney carrying the scent of coffee and bacon, a modest breakfast he had barely touched. Mason wasn't one for appetites these days. He paused, leaning against the half-mended fence. His right leg throbbed dully, an old wound that had never healed quite right. Weather's changing, he thought. His body had become a reliable barometer over the years. Buck, his faithful hound of uncertain lineage, lay in the shade of a scrub oak nearby. The dog's ears suddenly perked up his head, turning toward the abandoned cemetery on the hill half a mile away. A low, warning growl rumbled in the animal's chest. "What is it, boy?" Mason's voice was rough from disuse, startling even to his own ears. Buck stood, hackles raised, eyes fixed on something Mason couldn't see. The dog barked once, sharp and urgent, then looked back at Io's master as if imploring him to follow. Mason reached for his rifle, leaning against the fence post. Not out of fear. Fear was a luxury he'd abandoned long ago, but out of caution. 15 years in this wilderness had taught him that survival often depended on such instincts. "Show me," he commanded, and Buck took off at a trot toward the hill. As they crested the ridge, Mason noticed something strange, a dark line scarring the pale earth, too straight and deliberate to be natural. It looked like something heavy had been dragged across the ground, leaving a continuous furrow in its wake. The trail led from the direction of an old mining trail and disappeared over a small rise beyond the cemetery's crumbling stone markers. Mason followed his limp, more pronounced now that there was no one to hide it from. Each step sent a spike of pain through his hip, but he pressed on, eyes narrowed against the morning glare. Over the rise, the drag mark ended at a patch of disturbed earth. For a moment, the scene made no sense to him. Then a light breeze shifted the fine layer of dust, and Mason felt his blood run cold. Dark hair emerged from the ground, then the curve of a forehead, the bridge of a nose. A human head buried to the neck in the packed earth. "Dear God in heaven," Mason whispered, his rifle nearly slipping from suddenly numb fingers. It was a young woman. Her eyes were open, staring upward at the endless sky, but they saw nothing. Her skin was ashen beneath its coating of dirt, her lips cracked and bloodless. A single fly crawled across her face and she didn't blink. Mason dropped to his knees beside her, years of training taking over despite his shock. Two calloused fingers pressed against her neck, searching for a pulse with medical precision. Nothing at first, then there it was, weak, thready, but present. "Still alive," he breathed, scarcely believing it. He noticed something then, a piece of paper pinned to what little he could see of her dress collar, just visible above the ground. Carefully, he unpinned it and read the scrawled message, "The justice of God." Mason's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath his beard. He'd seen such justice before, during the darkest days of the war and after. Men using God's name to justify their own cruelty. Without hesitation, he began to dig, not with the shovel that stood in his barn, but with his bare hands. The earth was hard, unyielding after weeks without rain. His nails split, and his fingers bled as he clawed at the ground around her neck, then her shoulders. "Hold on," he muttered, though he doubted she could hear him. "Just hold on." As Mason dug, something stirred in the recesses of his mind, a memory or perhaps a prayer. Words he had spoken years ago on a rainy night when faith and purpose had abandoned him. "I swear before God, I will never touch a scalpel again." The oath he'd taken after Gettysburg, after watching too many men die under his hands, after making a choice that had haunted him every day since. Yet here he was, medical instincts awakening from their long dormancy. As he exposed her shoulders, he saw the bruising around her neck, the torn fabric of her dress. Not just violence, but calculated cruelty. Whoever had done this had wanted her to suffer. Buck whined anxiously, pacing back and forth as Mason worked. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying, but Mason didn't stop. Sweat and blood mingled on his hands, turning the dirt to mud as he carefully freed her from her earthen prison. When he finally exposed her to the waist, he slid his arms beneath her and pulled gently. Her body came free with unsettling ease. She was frightfully thin, all bone and sinew. Before lifting her completely, Mason ran his hands carefully along her spine, feeling each vertebra through the thin fabric of her dress. "No obvious fractures," he whispered, his doctor's training asserting itself after years of dormancy. He checked her limbs, next methodically feeling for broken bones beneath the alarming pattern of bruises. Years of battlefield medicine had taught him to be thorough even when time was of the essence. Mason gathered her into his arms, one behind her shoulders, the other under her knees. She was lighter than she should be and completely limp. Her head lolled against his chest, eyes still fixed on nothing. "I've got you now," he said quietly. "You're safe." The walk back to his cabin was slow and painful, his bad leg protesting with each step. By the time the weathered structure came into view, Mason's shirt was soaked with sweat. His breathing labored. Buck trotted ahead, looking back occasionally as if making sure Mason was still following. Inside the cabin was cool and dim. Mason laid the woman on his narrow bed, the only one in the house, and stepped back momentarily unsure. The cabin was spare utilitarian. A table, two chairs, a small stove, shelves lined with a few books and tins of food. A worn Bible sat on the table, its pages dog-eared and well-thumbed. It was the home of a man who expected nothing and needed less. Mason filled a basin with water from the barrel by the door and tore a clean strip from one of his few shirts. Gently he began to clean the dirt from her face, his touch clinical yet careful. He worked methodically, falling into the familiar rhythm of treating a patient. "Severe dehydration," he murmured to himself, noting her sunken eyes and parched lips. "Possible hypoxemia from chest compression. Early stages of exposure." When he had cleaned her face, Mason carefully tipped a few drops of water between her cracked lips. Too much too quickly would do more harm than good. He knew that from the battlefield, men dying of thirst would sometimes drown in their eagerness to drink. As he worked, Buck settled on the floor nearby, watchful eyes fixed on the stranger in his master's bed. Outside, shadows lengthened as the day waned toward evening. Mason knew what he needed to do next, but his hands trembled at the thought. In the corner of the cabin stood a heavy trunk untouched for years. He stared at it, feeling the weight of his long-ago oath pressing down on him. "Forgive me, Lord," he whispered, crossing to the trunk and kneeling before it. The brass key hung around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, alongside a simple wooden cross. He hadn't removed either in 15 years. With unsteady fingers, Mason unlocked the trunk and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay his medical kit from another life. The leather bag was still supple, preserved by the careful wrapping and dry Wyoming air. Mason brought it to the table and opened it with reverent caution. The steel instruments inside gleamed in the fading light. Scalpels, forceps, needles, tools meant to heal, to repair what was broken. His hand hovered over a syringe case, memories flooding back unbidden. Suddenly, he wasn't in his cabin anymore. The air was thick with the metallic stench of blood and the acrid bite of gunpowder. Canvas walls snapped in the wind as artillery boomed in the distance. A field hospital at Gettysburg, July 1863. Rain hammered the tent, turning the ground to mud that mixed with blood, creating a rusty slurry underfoot. On the table before him lay two men, Colonel James Harrington with a chest wound, and next to him 5 private soldiers with various injuries, all urgent. "We're running low on chloroform, doctor." a harried orderly reported, and we've got more coming in. Mason looked from the colonel to the privates, his mind racing. Military protocol was clear, officers took precedence. But the colonel's wound would take time and resources that could save all five of the others. Dr. Caldwell, a general, appeared at his elbow. The colonel is a personal friend of mine. I expect you to attend to him immediately. Orders were orders. Mason nodded grimly and directed his assistants to move the privates to the waiting area. One of them, barely more than a boy, caught Mason's sleeve with a bloody hand. Please, Doc, he pleaded, eyes bright with fear. I got a wife back home, a baby coming. You'll see them again, son, Mason promised, the lie bitter on his tongue. By dawn, the colonel lived. The five privates did not. The memory dissolved, leaving Mason standing in his cabin, medical instruments spread before him, the weight of his broken oath heavy on his shoulders. He looked at the woman on his bed. Her face, now clean of dirt, struck him with its familiar quality. Something about her features reminded him painfully of Mary, his Mary gone these 15 years. Mason's hand went to the scar on his left wrist, a long, pale line that told its own story of despair and survival. The aftermath of Mary's death, of the child who never drew breath, of his failure to reach them in time because he'd been tending to other men's wounds. Not this time, he whispered to the empty room, to the ghost that never left. Not again. He filled the syringe with morphine, just enough to ease her pain without suppressing her breathing further. His hand was steady now, the familiar weight of the instrument banishing the tremor that had plagued him moments before. As the needle pierced her skin, Mason felt the final thread of his oath snap. For better or worse, he was a doctor again. Night fell, bringing with it a profound silence, broken only by the occasional pop of wood in the stove and the woman's shallow breathing. Mason sat in a chair by the bed, watching for any change in her condition. Buck lay at his feet, equally vigilant. He had done what he could with his limited supplies. A careful examination had revealed no life-threatening internal injuries, though her body bore the marks of brutal treatment. The worst danger now was dehydration in the aftermath of restricted breathing. Every hour, Mason lifted her head slightly and placed a few drops of water on her lips, followed by a thin broth he'd prepared. Most dribbled down her chin, but he persisted, knowing that even the smallest amount absorbed might make the difference between life and death. During one such attempt, as midnight approached, her eyelids fluttered. It was such a small movement that Mason thought he'd imagined it. He leaned closer, studying her face in the lamplight. "Can you hear me?" he asked softly. No response, but he sensed a subtle shift. Something in her vacant stare had changed, a hint of awareness, perhaps, or simply a different quality of unconsciousness. Mason continued his ministrations, speaking quietly as he worked. "You're in my cabin. My name is Mason. You're safe now." Throughout the night, Mason dozed intermittently in his chair, waking at the slightest sound. Near dawn, he startled awake to find her eyes fixed directly on him, still empty, but somehow more present than before. "Good morning," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "That's a good sign, tracking movement. Your body's fighting back." He stood, stretching his stiff muscles, and moved to the stove to stoke the fire and put coffee on to boil. As he worked, he continued talking, keeping his tone conversational, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to chat with a nearly catatonic stranger. "Weather's turning. Feels like snow in the air, though it's early yet. Buck and I will need to bring in more firewood today." The routine of morning chores provided a sense of normalcy in the face of the extraordinary situation. Mason fed Buck, then prepared a thin porridge, setting a small bowl on the table beside the bed. "I'll be outside for a bit," he told her. "Rest. Try to take some water if you can." Outside, the morning air was indeed sharp with the promise of snow. Mason split wood mechanically, his mind never straying far from the woman in his cabin. Who was she? What had she done to deserve such cruelty? And who had the authority to mete out God's justice in such a barbaric manner? He was stacking the split logs when Buck suddenly growled, staring at the tree line. Mason straightened, hand going to the knife at his belt. But it was only a deer, a young buck with small antlers, pausing at the edge of the clearing before darting back into the forest. When Mason returned to the cabin, he found the water cup empty. The porridge remained untouched, but the fact that she'd managed a drink was encouraging. She lay as he'd left her, eyes open but vacant, no acknowledgement of his return. "That's good," he said, refilling the cup. "Water's the most important thing right now." As the day progressed, Mason fell into a routine around her stillness. He read aloud from his Bible during the morning hours, his deep voice filling the cabin with ancient words of comfort. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. In the afternoon, he cleaned his rifle and mended a tear in his coat, all the while keeping up a one-sided conversation about nothing in particular. The sound of a human voice, he reasoned, might provide an anchor to reality, something for her consciousness to grasp onto. Evening brought another small victory. She turned her head slightly toward the sound when he dropped a pan. The movement was minimal but deliberate. Her body was slowly remembering how to respond to the world. That night, as Mason dozed in his chair, a sound woke him, a soft whimper, barely audible over the crackling fire. The woman was trembling, her eyes wide with terror, though still unfocused. A nightmare, Mason guessed, or perhaps a memory breaking through. He moved to the bedside, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You're safe," he said firmly. "No one's going to hurt you here." The trembling continued. Acting on instinct, Mason took her hand in his. Her fingers were cold and they jerked at his touch, but didn't pull away. "I know what it's like," he said quietly. "The fear that follows you into sleep, the memories that never leave. But you survived. You're still here." Gradually, her trembling subsided, though her fingers remained coiled tightly around his. Mason stayed there, uncomfortable in his awkward position, half sitting on the edge of the chair, until her grip relaxed and her breathing deepened. Only then did he gently extract his hand and return to his chair, where he watched over her until dawn painted the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold. Days passed, each identical to the last. Mason established a routine that revolved around his silent patient. In the morning, he placed a bowl of thin porridge and a cup of water by her bed. In the evening, he cleared them away, noting with satisfaction that each day a little more was consumed. He bathed her face with a damp cloth and combed her long, dark hair with his fingers, careful of the tangles. He changed her torn dress for one of his clean shirts, averting his eyes as much as possible to preserve her dignity. He never tried to force her to speak or eat. He simply existed in the space with her, moving through his daily tasks with quiet efficiency. On the fifth day, as Mason read from the book of Psalms, she turned her head deliberately toward the sound of his voice. Her eyes, while still disturbingly empty, seemed to focus on his face for the first time. "Hello there," he said, lowering the Bible. "Good to see you joining us." No response, but it was progress nonetheless. That evening, as Mason played a simple tune on his harmonica, a skill developed during long nights on the battlefield, he noticed her fingers twitching slightly in time with the music. 1 week after finding her, Mason woke before dawn to a strange sound. For a moment he couldn't place it, then realized it was coming from the bed. Crying, silent tears streaming down her face, though her expression remained blank. Mason moved to her side, unsure how to comfort this woman he knew nothing about. "It's all right to cry," he said gently. "God knows there's enough in this world worth crying over." He offered her his handkerchief, and to his surprise, she took it. The movement was clumsy, uncoordinated, but deliberate. She clutched the worn fabric in her fist knuckles, white with the effort. That same day, as Mason prepared lunch, she sat up by herself for the first time. The movement caught his eye. She was struggling to push herself upright, arms trembling with the strain. Mason resisted the urge to help, intuiting that this was something she needed to accomplish on her own. When she finally managed to sit leaning back against the wall, her chest heaved with exertion. But in her eyes, Mason saw something new, a spark of determination breaking through the emptiness. "Well done," he said simply, and returned to his cooking. That evening, as the first snow of the season began to fall, painting the landscape in ghostly white, Mason sat by the fire reading his Bible. A slight movement caught his attention. The woman had risen from the bed and was making her way unsteadily toward him. Mason remained still, watching her careful progress. Each step seemed to require immense concentration. When she reached the second chair by the fire, she lowered herself into it, exhaling sharply, as if she'd completed a marathon. For a long time, they sat in silence. Mason didn't ask questions or offer platitudes. He simply turned back to his Bible, allowing her the dignity of her accomplishment without fuss or comment. The fire crackled and popped. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a blanket of silence. In this moment of perfect quiet, something shifted in the atmosphere, a bridge forming across the void that separated two damaged souls. The old wound in Mason's leg chose that week to act up. It started as a dull ache that he could ignore, But by the second day, pain radiated up his thigh hot and insistent. He'd seen it before. The first cold snap of winter often triggered inflammation in the old bullet wound. He tried to carry on with his routines, setting out food for his patient, tending to Buck, splitting more wood for the coming cold. But by evening, a fever had taken hold, making his hands shake and his vision blur at the edges. "Just need to rest a bit," he muttered, lowering himself into his chair by the fire. He must have lost consciousness, for when he opened his eyes again, the fire had burned low and the cabin was dark, save for a single lamp. Pain throbbed in his leg, duller now, but still present. Something cool pressed against his forehead, a damp cloth, he realized. Confused, Mason tried to sit up, but a firm hand on his shoulder held him in place. He turned his head and found himself looking into the face of his patient. She was kneeling beside his chair, her expression focused as she adjusted the cloth on his forehead. "You," he began, but she shook her head slightly, her first deliberate communication. Looking down, Mason saw that his pant leg had been cut away, exposing the angry red wound on his thigh. The old bullet scar was inflamed, the skin around it hot and swollen. But someone had cleaned it and applied a poultice of some kind, a green paste that smelled of herbs and earth. Fresh bandages wrapped his leg, applied with surprising skill. The fire had been built up again, warming the cabin against the snow that now fell heavily outside. A cup of something steaming sat on the table beside him. The woman pointed to the cup, then made a drinking motion. Mason took the cup, sniffing it cautiously. Willow bark tea, by the smell of it, a natural remedy for pain and fever. He sipped it slowly, watching her over the rim. Her movements were more assured now, though still deliberate, as if each required careful thought. "Thank you," he said when he'd finished the tea. She didn't respond, but her eyes, clear now and deeply brown, held his for a moment before she turned away to tend the fire. Mason drifted off again, the willow bark tea doing its work. When he woke, pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. The fever had broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed. His legs still ached, but the angry heat of infection had subsided. The woman sat in the chair opposite his, watching him with those clear brown eyes. Something had changed during the night. The vacant stare was gone, replaced by awareness and wariness. She held herself tensely, like an animal ready to flee. "I'm Mason Caldwell," he said, breaking the silence. "This is my cabin. I found you buried in the earth 7 days ago." She didn't speak, but her eyes widened slightly at the mention of her burial. Mason hesitated. "I was a doctor during the war." The admission felt strange on his tongue, an identity he'd denied himself for 15 years. The woman's gaze dropped to his hands, then to the medical bag that still sat open on the table, its instruments gleaming in the morning light. Her expression tightened, a flash of something, fear, recognition crossing her features. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her mouth. Her voice, when it finally came, was a rasp barely audible after days of silence. "Emma," she said. "Emma Blackwood." The sound of her voice, unexpected after so many days of silence, startled both of them. Emma touched her throat as if surprised by her own ability to speak. "Emma," Mason repeated, "you're safe here." Emma's gaze moved to the window, to the snow-covered landscape beyond. Her next words were so quiet that Mason had to lean forward to hear them. "They buried me because I knew the truth." Before Mason could ask what she meant, Emma's eyes rolled back and she slumped in the chair, exhaustion claiming her once more. Mason caught her before she could fall, the sudden movement sending a spike of pain through his injured leg. As he carried her back to the bed, Mason couldn't shake the feeling that her last words carried more weight than their simple meaning suggested. What truth could be worth burying someone alive for? The answer, he suspected, would bring nothing but trouble to his doorstep. But as he looked down at Emma's face, peaceful now in sleep, Mason knew it was already too late to turn back. Whether by choice or by fate, their paths had become intertwined. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing all traces of the world beyond. For now, at least, they were alone with their secrets. 3 days later, Mason's leg had improved enough for him to resume his normal activities, though he still favored it more than usual. Emma's recovery continued as well. She ate without prompting now and moved around the cabin with increasing steadiness, though she still tired easily. She spoke little, but Mason could sense her watching him, evaluating. Trust, he knew, would come slowly, if at all. Whatever had happened to her had left scars deeper than the physical bruising that was now beginning to fade. On a clear, cold morning, Mason sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Emma stood by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape, her fingers idly tracing patterns on the frosted glass. "There's a Bible verse," Mason said, breaking the comfortable silence that had developed between them, "that speaks of being buried and resurrected. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about me forever, yet hast thou brought up my life from corruption, O Lord my God." Emma turned from the window, her expression unreadable. "Jonah," she said, "in the belly of the whale." Mason nodded, surprised by her knowledge. "You know your scripture." "My father made sure of it." Something flickered in her eyes, pain quickly suppressed. He believed knowledge of God's word was as essential as breathing. It was the most she'd spoken at once since giving her name. Mason kept his focus on the rifle, not wanting to break the fragile moment with too much direct attention. "Your father sounds like a wise man." Emma's gaze returned to the window. He was. The past tense wasn't lost on Mason. He finished reassembling the rifle and set it aside, choosing his next words carefully. "Emma, I need to ask you about what happened. Who buried you? And why?" Her shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn from the window. For a long moment, Mason thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, as if reciting facts from a great distance. "Redemption," she said. "That's what they named the town, though there's precious little of it to be found there. 15 miles east of here." Mason knew of it vaguely, a relatively new settlement that had sprung up around the promise of silver in the nearby hills. He'd avoided it as he avoided all populated places. "I was a nurse there," Emma continued. "Learned from my father, who was a doctor before—" She trailed off, then gathered herself. "There's a man, Silas Holcroft, the mayor. He runs the town like his personal kingdom. And with him, Father Jeremiah. They call themselves God's servants." Her hand clenched into a fist against the glass. "They hold what they call courts of divine justice, judge and jury in one passing sentence on anyone who challenges their authority or breaks their rules." Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. He'd heard of such things, frontier justice taken to zealous extremes. "What was your crime?" he asked quietly. Emma turned to face him, her eyes suddenly fierce. "Healing the sick, using medicine instead of prayer. They called me a witch for knowing which herbs could bring down a fever or ease a cough." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Father Jeremiah said I bore the mark of Satan because I set a broken bone instead of simply praying over it." "And they buried you for that." Mason couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "No," Emma said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "They buried me because I knew what Holcroft really wanted. The land, my father's land. The homestead that's been in our family for generations. There's silver there, or so they believe." She moved away from the window, pacing the small confines of the cabin with restless energy. "My father refused to sell, said no amount of money was worth our heritage. A week later, he was found hanging from the bell tower. They called it suicide." Mason remained silent, letting her speak at her own pace. "But I knew better. I saw the bruises on his hands, the signs of struggle." Emma's voice shook with suppressed emotion. "When I started asking questions, gathering evidence, that's when they came for me. Said I was spreading lies against God's anointed leaders, that I was a witch who needed to be purged." She stopped pacing, her gaze fixing on the middle distance, seeing something beyond the cabin walls. "They held a trial in the church, the whole town watching. Holcroft and Jeremiah took turns reading from Leviticus and Exodus. 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.' And then they declared their sentence burial. Not death, they said, but a chance for God to show mercy if he willed it." Emma's hand went unconsciously to her throat where fading bruises still marked the skin. "They dragged me out of town at sunset, dug the hole while I watched. Holcroft whispered to me before they put me in, said my father had begged at the end, said I would too." Mason's hands clenched into fists at his sides, an unfamiliar rage building in his chest. He'd seen cruelty during the war, but this calculated malice was something different. "How long were you there before I found you?" 2 nights and a day, I think. It all blurred together. Emma's voice had gone hollow again. "I prayed for death, for rain to soften the earth so I could suffocate faster, for coyotes to find me and end it quickly." She looked at Mason, really looked at him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Instead, he sent you." The simple statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Mason wasn't sure he was ready to face. He'd spent 15 years hiding from God and man alike, convinced that his failures outweighed any good he might do in the world. "I'm no one's salvation, Emma," he said finally. "Just a man who couldn't leave another soul to suffer." Emma studied him for a long moment, her expression softening, almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes, Dr. Caldwell, that's all salvation needs to look like." She went to the stove, then moving the coffee pot over the heat with practiced ease, as if she'd been doing it for years instead of days. The conversation was over for now, but Mason sensed a shift between them. A tentative trust had been established, fragile but real. That night, as snow fell softly outside and Emma slept in his bed, Mason sat by the fire turning over her story in his mind. He knew he should feel relieved that her crime had nothing to do with him, that her presence brought no direct danger to his door. Instead, he found himself troubled by a growing sense that their meeting was no accident. The coincidence was too great, a doctor who'd abandoned his calling and a healer punished for practicing hers. It felt like the setup for some cosmic lesson he wasn't sure he wanted to learn. Mason's hand went to the scar on his wrist, tracing its length with a calloused finger. He hadn't thought about ending his life in years, but he remembered the despair that had driven him to it, the crushing weight of failure, the belief that the world would be better without him in it. Had Emma felt that way in her earthen prison? Had she welcomed death as he once had? Yet here they both were survivors against all odds. The thought should have brought comfort, but instead it filled Mason with unease. Survival meant purpose, and purpose meant responsibility. Things he'd fled from for 15 years. Outside, a wolf howled a long, mournful cry that seemed to echo his own uncertainty. Mason stoked the fire higher and settled in for another long night of watchfulness, wondering what price he would ultimately pay for digging Emma Blackwood out of her grave. The sound of approaching horses broke the stillness of the afternoon a week later. Mason was at the water pump filling a bucket when he heard them, three riders, by the sound of it coming up the long trail to his cabin. Buck growled, low hackles raised. Mason set down the bucket and reached for the rifle that was never far from his side these days. Emma appeared in the doorway of the cabin, her face pale but composed. "Stay inside," Mason told her, but she shook her head. "If it's them, hiding won't help. They've already seen the smoke from your chimney." The riders appeared over the rise, three men on well-kept horses. The one in front wore a black coat and a wide-brimmed hat, his beard neatly trimmed despite the wilderness setting. To his right rode a man in clerical black, a white collar visible at his throat. The third was younger, rough-looking, with a revolver strapped to his hip. Mason stepped forward to meet them, his rifle held casually but ready. Emma remained on the porch, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles showed white. The man in the lead reined in his horse and smiled down at Mason, the expression not reaching his eyes, which were the pale blue of winter ice. "Good afternoon, friend," he called. "Fine piece of property you have here." Mason didn't return the smile. "State your business." The man's smile didn't falter. "Silas Holcroft, Mayor of Redemption." He gestured to the man in clerical garb. "This is Father Jeremiah Wright, our spiritual leader, and this is Mr. Davis, who helps us with practical matters." Holcroft's gaze moved past Mason to the porch where Emma stood. His eyes widened fractionally, then narrowed. "Well," he said, his voice taking on a different quality, "this is unexpected. Miss Blackwood, isn't it? We had quite given you up for lost." The clergyman beside him crossed himself, murmuring something too low to catch. The third man simply stared, his hand drifting toward his gun. "As you can see, she's very much alive," Mason said, drawing Holcroft's attention back to him. "No thanks to whoever left her to die." Holcroft dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to Davis. He approached Mason, stopping just out of arm's reach. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, Mr. Caldwell." "Mason Caldwell." "Mr. Caldwell." Holcroft's smile remained fixed in place. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Miss Blackwood was sentenced by legal proceedings in Redemption. Her situation was the result of due process." Mason's grip tightened on his rifle. "Due process doesn't include burying people alive. God's justice takes many forms." Father Jeremiah interjected, his voice reedy and thin. "The sentence was meant to give her time to confess her sins and seek salvation." "Her crime?" Mason asked, though Emma had already told him. "Witchcraft," Jeremiah answered promptly. "Healing through unnatural means, spreading lies against God's appointed leaders." Emma stepped forward, her voice remarkably steady. "You mean refusing to let you steal my father's land?" questioning how a God-fearing man like him suddenly decided to commit suicide. Holcroft's smile finally slipped. Careful, Miss Blackwood. Such accusations remain slanderous even here. Mason positioned himself between Emma and the visitors. You've seen she's alive. Now state your actual business or be on your way. Holcroft reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. As it happens, my business concerns this land. All of it, including your cabin, Mr. Caldwell. He unfolded the paper, a deed elaborate with official-looking seals and signatures. The Territorial Land Office has granted the Western Union Mining Company rights to this entire valley. As the company's representative, I'm here to inform you that you have 1 week to vacate the premises. Mason didn't reach for the document. This has been my home for 15 years. I have papers of my own. I'm sure you do, Holcroft said smoothly, but I'm afraid the territorial governor has final say in these matters. Progress, Mr. Caldwell. The railway is coming, and with it, civilization. The way he said civilization made it sound like a threat. Mason remained unmoved, his expression neutral. 1 week, Holcroft repeated, tucking the deed back into his coat. His gaze shifted to Emma. Miss Blackwood, you have been formally excommunicated from redemption. Your family's property has been seized for unpaid taxes. However, as a gesture of Christian charity, we will not pursue further action against you, provided you remain silent about your experiences. His eyes glittered with malice poorly disguised as concern. Your father's fate was tragic, but dwelling on the past serves no one. Wouldn't you agree? Before Emma could respond, Father Jeremiah suddenly leaned forward in his saddle, peering at Mason with new intensity. Caldwell, he murmured as if trying to place the name. Mason Caldwell, the surgeon from Gettysburg. Mason went still, a cold weight settling in his stomach. It had been 15 years since anyone had addressed him by that title. Jeremiah's eyes widened with recognition. It is you. I was a field orderly during the battle. I remember now. His gaze took on an unsettling gleam. You're the one who let Dr. Blackwood die on your table, the girl's grandfather. Emma's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. Mason didn't turn to look at her, keeping his attention fixed on the 3 men before him. Jeremiah smiled, a thin stretching of lips that held no warmth. Divine providence indeed that you should be the one to find her. The wheel of God's justice turns in mysterious ways. Holcroft looked between them, clearly filing away this unexpected connection for future use. He remounted his horse with practiced ease. 1 week, Dr. Caldwell. Consider your options carefully. He tipped his hat. Progress can't be stopped. The 3 men turned their horses and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake, despite the snow-covered ground. Mason watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then finally allowed himself to look at Emma. She stood on the porch, her face drained of color, eyes wide with shock. The connection that Jeremiah had so casually revealed hung between them like a physical presence. Is it true? She whispered. My grandfather, Mason, closed his eyes briefly, the weight of 15 years of running suddenly crushing down on him. When he opened them again, he faced Emma squarely, offering the only thing he had left, the truth. Yes, he said simply. Dr. Thomas Blackwood. He died under my care at Gettysburg. I couldn't save him. Emma stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then without a word, she turned and went back into the cabin, closing the door quietly behind her. Mason remained where he stood, snow beginning to fall around him, once more blanketing the world in cold silence. Buck whined softly, pressing against his leg in canine concern. It's all right, boy, Mason said quietly, though they both knew it wasn't. It's all right. But as he looked toward the cabin, at the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney, Mason knew that nothing would be all right again. The past he'd fled for so long had finally found him, carried on the winds of a mountain snowstorm, to the door of his sanctuary, and with it came a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The door remained closed for hours. Mason sat on the porch, snow gathering on his shoulders as darkness crept across the valley. Buck whined occasionally, moving between his master and the cabin door with anxious energy. Give her time, boy, Mason murmured, though the cold had long since numbed his injured leg. Some truths cut deeper than knives. Inside, no sound, no movement. The thin column of smoke from the chimney was the only sign that life continued within. As the last light faded from the sky, stars appearing like distant pinpricks in the vast blackness, and Mason finally rose. His joints protested stiff from cold and stillness. He knocked once, gently. "Emma, I'm coming in." No response. Mason pushed the door open slowly. The cabin was warm, the fire built up higher than he'd left it. Emma sat at the table, her back straight, hands folded neatly before her. In the firelight, her profile reminded him again of Mary, the same determined set of the jaw, the same quiet dignity. Mason closed the door behind him, stamping snow from his boots. He moved to the fire, warming his hands, giving her space to speak first if she chose. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the snap and hiss of burning pine. Finally, Emma turned to face him. "Tell me about my grandfather." Not an accusation, not yet. Just a simple request delivered in a voice deliberately emptied of emotion. Mason owed her this much at least. "Thomas Blackwood." He began, settling heavily into his chair by the fire. "One of the finest surgeons I ever knew. When the war broke out, he was already in his 50s, could have stayed home, tended to his practice. Instead, he volunteered, said his skills were needed more on the battlefield than in a comfortable Boston office." Mason stared into the flames, seeing not the burning wood, but the chaos of a field hospital 15 years past. Gettysburg was the worst. 3 days of fighting, more wounded than we could count. Dr. Blackwood worked without rest, same as the rest of us. On the third day, they brought in a colonel with a chest wound. Protocol said officers took precedence, but 5 enlisted men had come in at the same time, only with treatable wounds if attended to quickly. Emma watched him, her face expressionless, though her knuckles whitened as her clasped hands tightened. "I was the senior surgeon present. The decision fell to me, the colonel or the 5 men. Before I could decide, a general arrived demanding the colonel receive immediate attention." Mason's voice grew distant. "He outranked me. I had my orders." "So you chose the colonel," Emma said quietly. "Yes, I directed Dr. Blackwood to operate on the colonel while I assessed the other men. But your grandfather—" Mason's mouth curved in a ghost of a smile. "He disagreed, said 5 lives outweighed 1 rank be damned. He refused to leave the private he was treating." Emma's eyes widened slightly. "The general was furious, ordered me to take over the colonel's surgery myself. I did as I was told. Your grandfather continued working on the enlisted men." Mason rubbed his palm over his beard. "The colonel lived. 2 of the 5 men survived thanks to your grandfather. He saved as many as he could before his heart gave out right there at the operating table." "His heart—" Emma's composure slipped. "Not a mistake, not something you did." Mason shook his head. "A lifetime of service ended in service. I tried to save him, but—" He spread his hands helplessly. "Some things are beyond even a doctor's skill." Emma absorbed this, her gaze searching his face for any sign of deception. "Then why did Father Jeremiah say you let him die? Why imply you were responsible?" "Because in war, someone always needs blame assigned," Mason said wearily. "I was in charge. The responsibility was mine. And perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps because I've spent 15 years believing it myself, that if I'd stood up to the general, if I'd backed your grandfather's decision, he might have lived longer. That the stress of defying orders alone hastened his end." He looked directly at Emma now. "I'm sorry, not for trying to save him. I did everything I could. But for not being the man he was, for not having his courage." The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling around the corners of the cabin with a mournful sound. Emma rose from the table and crossed to the window, looking out at the darkness. Her reflection in the glass was ghostly, superimposed over the night. "My father spoke of him often," she said finally. "Said he was a principled man who never compromised when lives were at stake." She turned to face Mason. "He also said my grandfather believed that the worst doctor was still better than no doctor at all." The words struck Mason like a physical blow. How many times had he told himself that his absence from medicine was a blessing to potential patients, that his failures disqualified him from the right to practice? "Your father sounds like a wise man," he managed. He was. Emma's voice caught on the past tense. "Until Holcroft and his court hanged him and called it suicide." Mason studied her, seeing not just Mary now, but something of Thomas Blackwood in the stubborn set of her chin, the unflinching gaze. "What will you do now?" he asked. Emma's expression hardened. "Survive. Bear witness." Make them pay for what they've done to my father to me. Her eyes met his challenging. What will you do, doctor? Caldwell, run again. Find another mountain to hide on. The question hung between them, sharp as a scalpel. Mason had no ready answer. Get some rest, he said finally. Tomorrow will bring troubles enough of its own. Emma held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded once and returned to the bed. Mason remained by the fire, feeding it occasionally throughout the night, wrestling with ghosts, both old and new. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the turbulence in Mason's soul. Morning broke clear in cold sunlight, glinting off snow with blinding brightness. Mason, who had dozed fitfully in his chair, woke to the smell of coffee brewing. Emma stood at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she worked. The normality of the scene was so at odds with the revelations of the previous day that for a moment Mason wondered if he'd dreamed it all. But when Emma turned, the wariness in her eyes told him otherwise. Sleep well? She asked, pouring coffee into his chipped enamel mug. Well enough. Mason accepted the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. I dreamed of Earth pressing down on me. Emma said it matter-of-factly without self-pity. I always do, but I woke up breathing, which is more than I expected a few weeks ago. They settled into an uneasy routine that morning. Mason tended to buck and split more wood for the approaching cold snap. Emma cleaned the cabin with brisk efficiency, occasionally pausing to rest when her still-recovering body demanded it. They spoke little, the weight of Holcroft's deadline and their newfound connection creating a tension neither seemed ready to address. But as the day progressed, Mason found himself watching Emma, the careful way she moved, the determination that straightened her spine when fatigue threatened to bend it. She was a Blackwood through and through. The thought brought both comfort and disquiet. That afternoon, as the early winter dusk approached, Mason found Emma examining his medical bag. Her fingers hovered over the instruments, not quite touching them. You keep them well maintained, she observed without looking up, for a man who's forsaken medicine. Mason leaned against the doorframe, watching. Oh, her old habits. Or perhaps not as forsaken as you'd like to believe. Emma finally met his gaze. These aren't the tools of a man who's truly given up his calling. They're ready for use at a moment's notice. Mason shifted uncomfortably. Practicality, nothing more. Injuries happen even to hermits. Emma's lips curved in the ghost of a smile. Is that what you are, a hermit? What would you call a man who's lived alone on a mountain for 15 years? A man waiting to be found, perhaps. Emma closed the medical bag carefully. Or a man punishing himself for a sin that exists only in his mind. Before Mason could respond, a sound from outside caught their attention, the high, thin wail of an animal in pain. Buck barked once from his place by the fire, ears pricked. Mason grabbed his coat and rifle, Emma close behind him. Outside, the sound came again from the direction of the creek that ran behind the cabin. They followed it, trudging through snow that reached mid-calf in places. At the creek's edge, partially submerged in the icy water, lay a young doe. Her leg was caught in the jaws of a rusty trap, the snow around her stained crimson. Poachers, Mason growled, setting his rifle aside. They set these traps on my land every winter. The doe's sides heaved with panicked breath as they approached, her dark eyes rolling in terror. Mason moved slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. Easy now, easy. Emma circled to the animal's head, kneeling in the snow despite the cold. With gentle hands, she stroked the doe's neck, murmuring softly. Gradually, the animal's struggles lessened. Mason examined the trap. The cruel metal teeth had pierced deep into the doe's legs, severing tendons and crushing bone. Even if they freed her, she would never walk properly again. A slow death by starvation or predators awaited her. Emma saw it too. Her eyes met Mason's over the injured animal, understanding passing between them. Can you help her? She asked quietly. Mason knew she wasn't asking if he could free the doe from the trap. He reached for his knife. A quick cut to the jugular would end the animal's suffering in seconds. Mercy, clean and simple. But as his hand closed around the knife's handle, he hesitated. Something in Emma's steady gaze challenged him. Not like that, she said. Heal her. Save her. Emma. Mason gestured to the mangled leg. The damage is too severe. Even if I could set the bone, the tendons are beyond repair. She'd be crippled, vulnerable. Like you, Emma's words were gentle but direct. Is that why you hide up here, Dr. Caldwell? Because you believe damage makes survival impossible. The doe made a soft, piteous sound between them. Mason looked from the animal to Emma and back, something shifting in his chest. "I'll need my bag," he said finally. Emma nodded and rose, hurrying back to the cabin, while Mason stayed with the doe, keeping her calm with his voice and touch. When Emma returned with his medical bag, her cheeks were flushed from the blood and exertion, but her eyes shone with a new light. "I can assist," she said, kneeling beside him. "My father taught me well." For the next hour, as daylight faded and stars appeared in the clear winter sky, doctor and nurse worked together on their unlikely patient. Mason's hands remembered what his mind had tried to forget: the precise pressure needed to extract metal from flesh, the careful cleaning of the wound, the delicate work of saving what could be saved and removing what could not. Emma anticipated his needs before he voiced them, handing him instruments, clearing blood from his field of vision, steadying the doe when pain caused her to struggle. They worked in near silence, communicating through gesture and shared purpose. When it was done, the doe's leg had been amputated below the knee, the only option given the extensive damage. Mason fashioned a poultice of yarrow and comfrey to prevent infection, binding it with strips of clean cloth. "She'll need to stay warm tonight," he said, wiping blood from his hands with snow. The shock could still kill her. Together they carried the sedated animal to the small lean-to beside the cabin where Mason kept his meager store of hay. They made a bed for her there, covering her with an old blanket. "Will she live?" Emma asked as they walked back to the cabin, the night now fully dark around them. "If she's strong enough," Mason replied. "If she wants to live badly enough." Emma glanced at him. "And will she be able to survive with only 3 legs?" "Animals adapt," Mason said. "Better than people sometimes. She'll learn a new way to move to balance. It won't be the life she had before, but it will be life," Emma finished for him. "And life has value even when it's altered." They reached the cabin door, but neither moved to enter. The stars above seemed impossibly bright, casting enough light to illuminate their faces. "Why did you make me save her?" Mason asked finally. Emma's gaze was steady. "Because I needed to know if you still could, if you still would." She stepped closer, her breath clouding in the cold air between them. "And because you needed to know it too." She reached out and took his hand, the hand that had just performed delicate surgery after 15 years of deliberate disuse. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. "Thank you," she said simply. Mason understood she wasn't thanking him merely for the doe. Something fundamental had shifted between them, a trust established, a connection acknowledged. Without another word, they entered the cabin, leaving footprints in the snow that the night wind would soon erase. The next morning, Mason woke to find Emma gone from the cabin. For a heart-stopping moment, he feared Holcroft's men had returned in the night and taken her. Then he noticed Buck was missing too, and footprints leading from the door toward the lean-to. He found them there, Emma sitting cross-legged in the hay beside the doe, who was remarkably alert despite her ordeal. Buck lay nearby, watching the proceedings with canine curiosity. "She ate a little," Emma reported without looking up, "and she tried to stand once, though she wasn't ready." Mason knelt beside her, examining his handiwork from the previous night. The wound looking clean, no signs of infection yet. The doe's eyes were clear, showing none of the glazed quality that would indicate fever or shock. "She's strong," he observed. "Good constitution." Emma smiled, a real smile that transformed her face, making her look younger, unburdened. "Like her doctor." Mason felt a strange warmth in his chest at her words. He turned his attention back to the doe, adjusting the bandages slightly. "We should name her, I suppose, if she's staying." "Grace," Emma said without hesitation, "for the amazing kind." The biblical reference wasn't lost on Mason. He nodded, acknowledging both the name and its significance. They spent much of that day tending to Grace, taking turns sitting with her, encouraging her to eat and drink. By evening, she was alert enough to make her first tentative attempt to stand on 3 legs. She managed it briefly before collapsing back into the hay, but the effort itself was promising. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Mason broached the subject they'd been avoiding. "Holcroft will return in 5 days. We need to decide what to do." Emma set aside the shirt she'd been mending, one of his torn, during their rescue of Grace. "We could leave, find somewhere else to start over." Mason shook his head. "He'd find us. Men like that don't let go easily, especially when they believe God sanctions their actions." "Then we stand and fight." Emma's voice hardened. "I won't run. Not from him. Mason studied her across the firelight, seeing the determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. That's not a fight we're likely to win, Emma. Holcroft has men weapons the law on his side, or at least the appearance of it. And what do we have, Dr. Caldwell? The truth, he answered simply. But truth alone rarely wins battles. Emma was quiet for the long moment, her fingers tracing the pattern of the shirt in her lap. My father had a harmonica, she said finally. He used to play it in the evenings after he'd finished seeing patients. The apparent non sequitur caught Mason off guard. I didn't know you had it with you. I don't. Holcroft took it along with everything else from our home. Emma's gaze returned to the fire. But the point is, there's something I haven't told you. Something about redemption, about what I discovered before they buried me. Mason leaned forward, sensing the importance of what was to come. Holcroft is poisoning the water, Emma said flatly. The creek that supplies the outlying farms, not the town well. Slowly, carefully, just enough to make livestock's sick crops fail. Enough to drive farmers into debt, force them to sell their land for a fraction of its worth. Mason's brow furrowed. How do you know this? My father suspected it first. As a doctor, he noticed patterns in the illnesses affecting people outside town. Too many similar symptoms all along the same waterway. Emma's voice grew more intense. Before he died, he collected water samples, tested them. He found traces of arsenic, not enough to kill quickly, but enough to sicken over time. And Holcroft discovered he knew. Emma nodded. Father confronted him privately, threatened to expose him. 3 days later, he was hanging from the bell tower. Her hands clenched into fists. I found his notes afterward, hidden in a false bottom of his medical bag. When I started testing water samples myself, continuing his work, Holcroft must have realized I knew too. So it wasn't just about your land, Mason said slowly. It was about silencing you both. The land was part of it. There is silver there, just as I told you. But it's about power more than wealth. Holcroft wants to own the town, body, soul, and water supply. Emma's gaze was unflinching. And I'm the only one left who knows the truth. The fire crackled between them as Mason processed this new information. It changed things, made their situation more dangerous, but also offered a potential weapon. Do you have proof? He asked. Your father's notes, the water samples. Emma shook her head. Holcroft would have destroyed anything left at our house. But, she hesitated, there's a cave about a mile upstream from town. My father and I used it as a laboratory of sorts. If Holcroft didn't find it, the evidence might still be there. That's a significant if, Mason pointed out. I know, but it's the only chance we have. Emma set the shirt aside and leaned forward, her expression earnest. Dr. Caldwell Mason, I can't face Holcroft alone. I need your help. Not just as a man with a gun, but as a doctor who understands what this kind of poisoning can do, who can verify my father's findings. The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. Mason had spent 15 years avoiding exactly this kind of responsibility, this kind of risk. He'd come to Wyoming to disappear to ensure his mistakes could hurt no one else. Yet here was Emma Blackwood asking him to step back into the world, to use the skills he'd denied for so long, to take a stand that could not be undone. I dug you out of the earth, he said finally. I suppose that makes me somewhat responsible for what you do with your second chance at life. A smile touched Emma's lips. Is that a yes? It's an acknowledgement that hiding hasn't brought me the peace I sought, Mason replied. Perhaps it's time to try something different. Emma reached across the space between them and took his hand, her touch warm and sure. Thank you. Mason squeezed her fingers gently. Don't thank me yet. We still need a plan, one that doesn't end with both of us buried side by side. Tomorrow, Emma said. We'll figure it out tomorrow. She stood still, holding his hand, and in a gesture that surprised them both, leaned down to press a kiss to his weathered cheek. Good night, Mason. As she moved to the bed, Mason remained by the fire, his hand unconsciously touching the spot where her lips had brushed his skin. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a profound silence, broken only by the occasional pop of burning wood. For the first time in many years, Mason Caldwell felt something stir within him that he'd thought long dead, hope fragile but persistent, like the first green shoot breaking through winter soil. They spent the next day preparing. Mason cleaned his rifle and checked his limited supply of ammunition. Emma fashioned a crude map of redemption and its surroundings, marking the location of the cave where her father had conducted his experiments. "It's here," she said, pointing to a spot along the creek about a mile northeast of town. "The entrance is hidden behind a stand of pines, but it's large enough inside to stand upright. We used to store equipment there, test tubes, chemicals, my father's notebooks." Mason studied the map. "And Holcroft's property." Emma's finger moved to a large area on the opposite side of town. "His house is here on the hill overlooking Redemption. The silver mine he's developing is further west, but he doesn't go there often. Too much like real work." Her voice held a trace of bitter humor. "What about Father Jeremiah? Where does he fit into all this?" Emma's expression darkened. "He believes whatever Holcroft tells him to believe, or at least he pretends to. The townspeople trust him. He performs the weddings, baptizes the babies, leads the prayers. His support gives Holcroft's actions the veneer of divine approval." Mason considered this. A dangerous combination, greed masked as righteousness. "The most dangerous kind," Emma agreed. "It's why the town stood by and watched as they put me in the ground. They believed they were witnessing God's justice, not a murder." The word hung in the air between them. Murder, what had nearly happened to Emma, what had happened to her father, what might yet happen to them both if they miscalculated. As dusk approached, Mason checked on Grace. The young doe was showing remarkable resilience, already able to stand and take a few halting steps on her 3 remaining legs. Her wound was healing cleanly with no sign of infection. "You did good work," Emma said, joining him in the lean-to. "Saved her life." "We saved her life," Mason corrected. "I couldn't have done it alone." Emma smiled, kneeling to stroke the doe's soft neck. "A doctor needs a good nurse." "And sometimes a nurse needs a doctor," Mason replied. "Your father taught you well, Emma. You have a natural gift for healing." A shadow passed over her face at the mention of her father. "He wanted me to go east to one of the women's medical colleges. Said times were changing, that there'd be a place for female doctors someday." She sighed. "That dream died with him, I suppose." "Dreams can be revived," Mason said quietly, "like patience thought beyond saving." Emma looked up at him, something vulnerable in her expression. "Is that what happened to you after Gettysburg? Did your dream of being a doctor die?" Mason considered the question more honest with himself than he had been in years. "Not die exactly. It was more like amputation. I cut it away because I thought the pain of keeping it would kill me." He glanced at Grace standing brave on her 3 legs. "But perhaps I was wrong about what could be saved." They returned to the cabin as the first stars appeared, a companionable silence between them. Over dinner, a simple stew of dried meat and the last of the summer's preserved vegetables, they finalized their plan. "We'll go to the cave tomorrow," Mason decided. "If your father's evidence is still there, we take it straight to the territorial marshal in Laramie. Not the local sheriff, he's probably in Holcroft's pocket." Emma nodded. "It's a 3-day ride to Laramie if the weather holds." "Then we'll need supplies." Mason began making a mental list. Food, extra ammunition, blankets. The mountain passes will be cold this time of year. "And if the evidence is gone," Emma asked the question they had both been avoiding, and Mason met her gaze steadily. "Then we find another way. I've spent 15 years hiding from my responsibilities, Emma. I won't run from this one." That night, as snow began to fall again, outside, Mason lay awake on his pallet by the fire, listening to Emma's steady breathing from the bed. The risks they were taking were substantial. Not just the confrontation with Holcroft, but the journey itself. Wyoming winters were unforgiving, and Emma was still recovering her strength. Yet the alternative, abandoning his home, allowing Holcroft's crimes to go unpunished, was unthinkable. Somewhere in the past weeks, a line had been crossed. Mason could no more walk away from Emma Blackwood than he could stop breathing. It wasn't just about atonement anymore, about making up for past failures. It was about choosing to live fully again, to care about something beyond mere survival. As sleep finally claimed him, Mason's last conscious thought was of Emma's kiss on his cheek, brief but unmistakably real. Like the first hint of spring after the longest winter. They set out at dawn, leaving Buck to guard the cabin and keep watch over Grace. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving a pristine white landscape glittering in the early morning sun. Their breath clouded before them as they trudged through drifts, sometimes reaching mid-calf. Mason had insisted Emma wear his heavy winter coat, leaving himself with just a wool jacket. She'd protested, but he'd been firm. You're still recovering, he'd said. The last thing we need is you taking ill again. The journey to redemption would take most of the day on foot. They traveled in silence for the first few hours, each lost in their own thoughts, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional call of a winter bird. As the sun climbed higher, Emma broke the silence. Tell me about her. Mason glanced at her startled. Who? The woman you lost, the one who left that look in your eyes. Emma's gaze was direct, unapologetic. I've seen it before in the mirror after my father died. For a moment, Mason considered deflection the habit of 15 years of solitude. But something about the clear mountain air, the vastness of the snow-covered landscape, made prevarication seem pointless. Mary, he said the name, feeling strange on his tongue after so long unspoken. My wife, she died in childbirth while I was away at the war. Emma didn't offer empty condolences for which Mason was grateful. The baby, she asked instead. A boy. He never drew breath. Mason adjusted his rifle strap the familiar way to comfort against old pain. I'd received leave to come home for the birth. I was delayed a skirmish, an officer who wouldn't release me. By the time I arrived, they were both gone. And you blamed yourself, Emma said, not a question. I was a doctor who couldn't save his own wife and child. What would you call it? Emma was quiet for several steps. Human, she said finally. I'd call it tragically, unavoidably human. Mason didn't reply, but her words settled somewhere deep inside him, a truth he wasn't quite ready to acknowledge, but couldn't fully deny. They crested a rise around noon, and in the valley below, redemption came into view. From this distance, it looked like any other frontier town, a cluster of wooden buildings along a single main street, a church steeple rising above the rest. Thin columns of smoke rose from chimneys dissolving into the clear blue sky. Emma stopped, her face tightening at the sight. Mason touched her arm lightly. We don't have to go through town, he reminded her. Your map shows a path that circles around to the creek. She nodded, visibly steeling herself. I know, it's just, I never thought I'd see it again. Not after they put me in the ground. You don't have to go back at all, Mason said. Tell me where the cave is. I can go alone. Emma shook her head firmly. No, I need to do this. For my father. For myself. They skirted the town, keeping to the tree line where the snow was shallower. Mason remained vigilant, rifle ready, but they encountered no one. Most of Redemption's residents would be occupied with daily chores, unaware of the two figures moving like shadows at the edge of their world. The creek lay frozen along its edges, though the center still flowed dark water gurgling beneath a thin crust of ice. They followed it upstream, away from town, until they reached a dense stand of pine trees clustered at the base of a rocky outcropping. Here, Emma said, pushing through the branches, behind these trees. Mason followed, ducking low-hanging limbs. The entrance to the cave was well concealed, a narrow opening partially obscured by a fallen log and years of accumulated pine needles. If you didn't know to look for it, you'd walk right past. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately, the air cool and damp. The cave opened wider after the entrance, forming a natural chamber about 15 feet across. Enough light filtered through the opening to illuminate the space dimly. Emma moved with purpose toward the back wall, where a natural shelf of rock held what they'd come for, a wooden box, dusty but intact. It's still here, she breathed, relief evident in her voice. She lifted the box carefully and brought it to the center of the cave where the light was better. Inside lay the fruits of Thomas Blackwood's final investigation. Notebooks filled with precise handwriting, small glass vials of water samples, a crude but effective testing kit. Emma lifted one of the notebooks reverently, her fingers tracing her father's handwriting. This is it, she said. All his observations, the test results, even a map showing where each sample was taken. She handed the book to Mason. See for yourself. Mason examined the notebook, impressed by the meticulous documentation. Dr. Blackwood had been thorough, recording symptoms observed in both people and livestock, correlating them with water sources, and finally identifying the probable cause, introduced deliberately into the creek above the farms, but below the town's main water supply. Your father built a solid case, Mason said, turning pages. This would convince any reasonable authority. Emma smiled sadly. He was always methodical. Said medicine was as much about observation as intervention. She ran her hand along the testing kit. He taught me how to use this, how to detect poison in water, how to document evidence scientifically. She began carefully packing the materials back into the box. We should go. It's a long walk back to the cabin and we'll lose daylight soon. Mason helped her secure the box, wrapping it in an oilskin cloth they'd brought for this purpose. They were just preparing to leave when a sound from outside froze them in place. Voices approaching the cave entrance. Tracks lead this way, a man was saying. Fresh couldn't be more than an hour old. Spread out, another voice ordered, one Mason recognized with a chill. Holcroft. Check along the creek bank. They can't have gone far. Emma's eyes widened in alarm. Mason put a finger to his lips, then pointed deeper into the cave away from the entrance. They retreated as quietly as possible, the box clutched to Emma's chest. The cave narrowed toward the back, but didn't end completely. Instead, it doglegged to the left, creating a natural hiding place invisible from the entrance. Mason and Emma pressed themselves against the damp rock wall, hardly daring to breathe. Light flooded the front of the cave as someone pushed aside the branches concealing the entrance. In here, a voice called. There's a cave. Footsteps crunched on the rocky floor, then stopped. Someone's been here recently, Holcroft's voice observed. Dust is disturbed. Want us to check deeper in, boss? Another man asked. A pause during which Mason could imagine Holcroft surveying the cave with those cold blue eyes. No need, Holcroft said finally. There's nothing of value here. Just an old hideout the Blackwood girl and her father used. We already took anything useful months ago. Mason felt Emma tense beside him at the casual mention of the theft of her father's possessions. He placed a steadying hand on her arm. Let's move on, Holcroft continued. They're probably heading for Laramie. Davis, take 2 men and cover the South Pass. The rest of you come with me. We'll check Caldwell's cabin first. The light dimmed as they left, the cave voices fading as they moved back toward the creek. Mason and Emma remained motionless for several long minutes, ensuring the men were truly gone. They're going to the cabin, Emma whispered, finally, horror in her voice. Buck Grace. Buck can handle himself, Mason reassured her, though concern gnawed at him too, and they won't waste bullets on a 3-legged deer. How did they find us? Emma clutched the box tighter. How did they know we'd come here? Someone must have seen us on the ridge, Mason theorized. Or they've been watching the cab and saw us leave this morning. He peered around the bend of the cave. The entrance looks clear. We need to move, but not back to the cabin. Not yet. Where then? Mason considered their options, none of them good. Redemption, he said finally. It's the last place they'll expect us to go. Are you mad? Emma hissed. That's the lion's den. Exactly why it might work, just long enough for us to figure out our next move. Mason checked his rifle. We need a place to hide until dark. Then we can try to circle back to the cabin, get what we need for the journey to Laramie. Emma looked unconvinced but nodded reluctantly. There's a place, the old livery stable at the edge of town. It's been abandoned since the owner died last spring. We could hide there until nightfall. Good. Let's go and stay low. With luck, all of Holcroft's men are out searching the wilderness for us. They emerged cautiously from the cave, the precious box secured in the oilskin wrap and tied to Emma's back. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they made their way downstream, keeping to the tree line, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Redemption loomed before them, no longer a distant cluster of buildings, but a very real threat. Mason felt Emma's fear and the tension of her body as they crouched at the edge of town, surveying the quiet street. There, she whispered, pointing to a weathered structure standing apart from the main buildings. The livery. We can enter through the back. There's a broken board in the wall I used to use as a shortcut. Mason nodded. Lead the way. And Emma, he caught her eye. Whatever happens, don't let go of that box. It's our only chance. Emma's jaw set with determination. I won't. I promise. Together they slipped from the shelter of the trees and darted across the open ground toward the abandoned stable, 2 fugitives seeking sanctuary in the very heart of enemy territory. The livery stable smelled of old hay and animals long gone. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the weathered boards. Emma led Mason to the hayloft, accessible by a ladder that looked none too sturdy. No one comes here anymore, she explained in a whisper. Not since old Mr. Finch died. His son moved to Denver, and Holcroft hasn't bothered to claim the property yet. They settled in the loft, concealed by bales of moldering hay. Emma carefully unwrapped the box, checking that nothing had been damaged in their flight. Mason kept watch through a crack in the wall overlooking the main street of Redemption. The town was quieter than he'd expected, with few people visible. An old man dozed on a bench outside the general store. A woman hung laundry behind one of the houses. Two young boys played with sticks in the dirt. Normal life unaware of the corruption festering at its core. Tell me about your father, Mason said softly, still watching the street. Not just his work, the man himself. Emma's fingers stilled on the notebooks. He was kind, she said after a moment. Gentler than most men out here. He'd treat anyone who needed help regardless of their ability to pay. Sometimes he'd come home with a chicken or a sack of potatoes instead of money. A smile touched her lips at the memory. He loved music. That harmonica I mentioned, he played it every evening after supper. Said music was God's medicine for the soul. Her smile faded. He wasn't perfect. He drank too much after my mother died when I was 12, but he always made sure I was cared for, educated. He taught me everything he knew about medicine, even the things most men wouldn't teach a daughter. He sounds like a good man, Mason said, like his father before him. They were similar in many ways from what he told me. Both stubborn, both devoted to healing. Emma looked down at her hands. Both dead before their time because they stood up for what was right. The unspoken question hung between them. Would she meet the same fate with Mason? As the afternoon waned toward evening activity, in the town increased slightly. Men returned from work, smoke rose from kitchen chimneys, lamps were lit in windows. From their hidden vantage point, Mason and Emma watched the rhythm of life and redemption unfold. There, Emma whispered suddenly, pointing toward the far end of the street. A group of riders appeared, Holcroft at their head. They moved slowly down the main street, stopping occasionally to speak to townspeople. Even from a distance, Mason could see the frustration in Holcroft's posture. They didn't find what they were looking for at the cabin, he murmured. Buck, Emma asked anxiously, would have been with them if they'd caught him. Dogs make good trophies. Mason's mouth set in a grim line. No, they went back empty-handed, which means they'll be looking even harder now. The riders stopped before the church where Father Jeremiah emerged to greet them. A discussion ensued with much gesturing and head-shaking. Finally, Holcroft dismounted and followed the clergyman inside. The other men dispersed, some to the saloon, others to various houses. This might be our chance, Mason said. Once it's fully dark, we can try to make it back to the cabin, gather supplies, and be on the trail to Laramie before dawn. Emma nodded, but her attention had shifted to something below them in the street. A woman had paused outside the livery, looking around as if making sure she wasn't observed. Then she slipped inside the stable. Mason and Emma froze, hardly daring to breathe. Footsteps moved across the dirt floor below, then stopped. Emma, a soft voice called. Emma Blackwood, are you here? Emma gasped, recognition lighting her features. Mrs. Peterson, she whispered to Mason. She was one of my father's patients. Her farm is one of those affected by the poisoned water. Before Mason could stop her, Emma moved to the edge of the loft. I'm here, Mrs. Peterson, she called softly. An older woman looked up, relief washing over her weathered face. Oh, child, I thought it might be you I saw sneaking in here. The whole town's talking about how you escaped burial and have been hiding in the mountains with a stranger. How did you know to look for me here? Emma asked, climbing down the ladder. Mason followed reluctantly, rifle at the ready. Mrs. Peterson eyed Mason warily but seemed to accept his presence. I didn't, not exactly. I come here sometimes to be alone with my thoughts. My late husband used to work here, you see. Her gaze returned to Emma. They're saying terrible things about you, child. That you practiced witchcraft, that you corrupted an innocent man. She glanced at Mason. I assume that would be you, sir. Mason Caldwell, he introduced himself. And I was far from innocent before I met Miss Blackwood. The older woman nodded, seeming to approve of his directness. I never believed what they said about you or your father, Emma. Samuel Blackwood was a good man who helped my Robert when no one else would, and you have his kindness in you. Mrs. Peterson, Emma said urgently, we need your help. My father discovered something before he died, proof that Holcroft has been poisoning the creek that feeds the outlying farms, including yours. That's why your cattle have been sickly, why your crops failed last season. The woman's eyes widened. Poisoning, but why would he do such a wicked thing? To force you to sell your land cheaply, Mason explained. Land he knows contains silver deposits. Understanding dawned on Mrs. Peterson's face. The offers, she murmured. Holcroft's been trying to buy our farm for months, offering less than half its worth. Said it was Christian charity to take it off our hands. since we can't seem to make it profitable anymore." Her expression hardened. "That snake." "We have proof," Emma said, gesturing to the box still hidden in the loft. "My father's notes, water samples. We're trying to get to Laramie, to the territorial marshal." Mrs. Peterson straightened her shoulders, decision made. "You'll need help. Food, fresh horses. Robert Jr. can guide you through the back country. He knows every trail and deer path between here and Laramie." "It's dangerous," Mason warned. "Holcroft won't hesitate to hurt anyone who helps us." "Holcroft has taken enough from this town," Mrs. Peterson said firmly. "My husband, your father, too many others. It's time someone stood against him." She moved toward the door. "Wait here. I'll return after dark with Robert Jr. and supplies." After she left, Mason turned to Emma. "Can we trust her?" "With my life," Emma said without hesitation. "She was like a mother to me after my own past. If she says she'll help, she will." They returned to the loft to weight the box of evidence between them like a talisman. Outside, redemption settled into evening routines. The church bell rang for evening service, its clear tone echoing across the town. "Your father would be proud of you," Mason said quietly, carrying on his work seeking justice for him. Emma smiled faintly. "I hope so." She looked at him directly. "And your wife, would she be proud of the man you have become?" Mason considered the question honestly. "No," he said finally. "Mary would be disappointed in the years I wasted hiding from life. But perhaps she would approve of what I'm trying to do now." Emma reached across the space between them and took his hand, her touch warm in the growing chill of evening. "It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, Mason. That's what my father always said." As darkness fell completely over redemption, they sat side by side in the dusty hayloft, hands clasped waiting for either salvation or discovery. The box of evidence rested beside them, physical proof of one man's courage and another's corruption. Below in the town, lights glowed in windows like earthbound stars. Among them somewhere, Holcroft and Jeremiah planned their next move, unaware that the truth they had tried to bury was about to rise from the ground, like Emma herself had done, damaged, but undefeated and determined to see justice done. Darkness had fully claimed redemption when the stable door creaked open once more. Mason tensed, rifle ready, but Emma laid a gentle hand on his arm. She recognized the hushed whispers below. Mrs. Peterson had returned, and as promised. "Emma," the older woman called softly, "are you still here?" They descended from the hayloft. Emma first with the precious box of evidence, Mason following with watchful eyes. Mrs. Peterson wasn't alone. Beside her stood a young man with her same resolute jawline, Robert Jr., and behind him a girl of perhaps 16, her face partially hidden by a woolen scarf. "This is my son," Mrs. Peterson explained, "and his wife Sarah. They'll guide you through the back country to Laramie." The young man nodded solemnly. "Pa always said we'd have to stand up to Holcroft someday. Guess that day's come." His wife stepped forward, offering a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Food for the journey, bread, dried meat, some of last summer's preserves." Mrs. Peterson gestured to the rear of the stable. "We've brought horses, nothing fancy, but sturdy and sure-footed in mountain terrain. And these trees." She handed Mason a bundle that clinked softly. When he unwrapped it, he found the ammunition for his rifle. "Robert's," she explained. "He'd want you to have it." "This is a great risk you're taking," Mason said gravely. "If Holcroft discovers you've helped us, then we'll face that when it comes." Mrs. Peterson interrupted. "Some things are worth risking everything for. Justice is one of them." Emma embraced the older woman tightly. "Thank you for believing in me and my father." "Your father saved my Robert's life once," Mrs. Peterson replied, returning the embrace. "Perhaps now we can help save his good name." Young Robert checked the cinches on the horses, two sturdy mountain ponies accustomed to difficult terrain. "We need to move soon," he said. "There's a storm brewing in the high country. If we can get through Cedar Pass before it hits, we'll have a clear shot to Laramie." Mason secured their supplies and the evidence box to one of the horses, then helped Emma mount. Her movements were stronger than they had been, but he could see the strain of the day's exertions in the tightness around her eyes. "Are you sure you're up to this?" he asked quietly. "It's a hard ride under the best conditions." Emma's chin lifted with characteristic determination. "I've been ready since the day they put me in the ground." Robert doused the single lantern they'd been using, plunging the stable into darkness. broken only by faint moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. "Follow me," he whispered. "Stay close, and if I signal to stop, freeze where you are." They led the horses out through the broken rear wall of the stable into the Sorod area behind Redemption's main street. The night was cold and clear stars blazing overhead like distant campfires, their breath clouded before them ghostly in the moonlight. Robert guided them along back alleys and through vacant lots, skirting the edges of town where few windows showed light. The church loomed dark and silent as they passed its steeple, a black finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. They were nearly at the edge of town when a door banged open somewhere behind them. Loud voices carried in the still night air, men emerging from the saloon, their words slurred by whiskey and the cold. "Checking the Peterson place again tomorrow. Holcroft says they're hiding something. Waste of time. That old woman doesn't know anything. $50 to whoever finds the Blackwood Witch." The voices faded as the men staggered in the opposite direction. Mason felt Emma stiffen in her saddle, but she remained silent, her face a pale oval in the darkness. They continued on, leaving the last buildings of Redemption behind, following a narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and aspen. The night grew colder as they climbed the air so crisp it hurt to breathe deeply. Mason kept close to Emma, watching for signs of fatigue or pain. "We'll stop at Widow's Creek to water the horses," Robert said, after they'd been riding for nearly 2 hours. "Then it's straight up to Cedar Pass. If we push hard, we can reach the summit by dawn." The creek, when they reached it, ran swift and dark between banks of snow and ice. The horses drank eagerly while the humans stretched cold, stiffened limbs. Emma moved to Mason's side, speaking low. "They're going to the Petersons tomorrow. They'll know they helped us." Mason nodded grimly. "Likely so. But there's nothing we can do about that now, except make sure their risk wasn't for nothing. We get this evidence to Laramie, make it count." Emma's gloved hand found his in the darkness. "I keep thinking about Grace," she admitted. "That little doe trying so hard to stand on 3 legs. Do you think she'll make it? If Buck has anything to say about it, yes." Mason squeezed her fingers reassuringly. "He's taken quite the protective interest in her." Emma smiled faintly. "Rather like someone else I know." Before Mason could respond, Robert signaled it was time to move on. They remounted and continued climbing the trail, growing steeper and narrower. The trees thinned, exposing them more to the bitter wind that swept down from the higher elevations. Emma rode silently, her back straight, despite what must have been considerable discomfort. Mason found himself watching her with a mixture of admiration and concern. She had endured more than most could bear, yet somehow maintained a core of strength that adversity had tempered rather than broken. As the night deepened toward its coldest hours, the trail wound along a precipitous ledge. To their right rose a sheer rock face. To their left, a drop of several hundred feet into darkness. Robert slowed, signaling caution. "Ice here," he warned. "Single file and give the horses their heads. They know the way better than we do." They proceeded with exaggerated care, the only sounds the soft clop of hooves on stone and the occasional dislodged pebble falling into the void. Mason went last, watching anxiously as Emma navigated the treacherous path ahead of him. They had nearly reached the end of the exposed section when Robert's horse suddenly shied, rearing slightly. A dark shape scuttled across the path, a mountain lion startled from its rest by their approach. The big cat snarled once, then vanished into the rocks, but the damage was done. Robert's horse skittered sideways, hooves slipping on the icy trail. Emma's mount, picking up on the fear, began to back up nervously, pushing her dangerously close to the edge. "Easy," Mason called, dismounting quickly despite the precarious footing. "Emma, stay still. Let the horse settle." He approached carefully, speaking in low, soothing tones. Emma remained motionless in the saddle, her knuckles white on the reins. The horse's eyes rolled, showing white, but it responded to Mason's calm voice, the tension gradually leaving its body. "That's it," Mason murmured, taking hold of the bridle. "You're safe. Nothing to fear." The horse blew out a breath, steam billowing in the cold air, and allowed Mason to lead it back to the center of the trail. Robert, who had regained control of his own mount, looked back with evident relief. "Sorry about that," he said. "These mountains have teeth sometimes." They continued more cautiously, leading the horses through the remaining exposed sections. When they finally reached wider, safer ground, Mason helped Emma dismount briefly to rest. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I thought for a moment." "I know." Mason kept his hand on her elbow, steadying her. But you stayed calm. That's what matters in a crisis. The sky was beginning to lighten, not yet dawn, but the first hint that night was retreating when they reached Cedar Pass. The wind cut like a knife at this elevation, finding every gap in their clothing. Before them stretched a broad saddle between two higher peaks, covered in deep snow, unmarked by human passage. "We'll cross quickly," Robert advised. "Storm's coming faster than I thought." He pointed to the western horizon where dark clouds were building, obscuring the stars. "We don't want to be caught up here when that hits." They urged their tired horses forward into the fresh snow, which reached past the animals' knees in places. Progress was slow, each step requiring effort from both horse and rider. The temperature seemed to drop further as they crossed the exposed pass, the wind finding new strength to oppose them. Mason watched Emma with growing concern. Her face was pale beneath her scarf, her lips taking on a bluish tint. The physical demands of the journey were taking their toll on a body still recovering from severe trauma. "Robert," he called, "how much further to shelter?" The young man glanced back then at the approaching storm. "Old mining cabin about 3 miles down the other side. We can wait out the worst of it there." Mason nodded, calculating. 3 miles in deteriorating conditions with Emma's strength failing visibly. It would be close. The first snowflakes began to fall as they crested the pass, small and hard as grains of sand driven horizontally by the wind. Within minutes, it had intensified to a proper squall, reducing visibility to mere yards. "Stay close," Robert shouted over the rising wind. "Follow my track." They descended as quickly as safety allowed, the horses plunging through deepening snow with increasing difficulty. Emma swayed slightly in her saddle, and Mason moved his mount alongside hers, ready to catch her if she fell. "Almost there," he encouraged, though he had no way of knowing if it was true. "Just a little further." Emma nodded, too exhausted for speech. Her eyes were fixed on the trail ahead, sheer determination keeping her upright. The storm intensified, transforming the world into a swirling, white void. Robert was barely visible a few yards ahead, a darker shape in the whiteness. The cold had become a living entity, seeking entry through every seam and fold of clothing. When the cabin finally appeared, it seemed like a mirage, a dark, solid shape emerging from the blizzard. Squat and weathered, it offered the only shelter for miles around. Robert dismounted and forced the door open against accumulating snow. Inside was cold and musty, but blessedly free from the punishing wind. A small fireplace stood against one wall, and rough bunks lined another. It wasn't much, but it meant survival. Mason helped Emma from her horse, alarmed at how heavily she leaned on him. Her skin felt cold to the touch, her movements sluggish. "Get her inside," Robert said, already working to unsaddle the horses. "I'll deal with the animals." The cabin's interior was Spartan: a table, a few broken chairs, the bunks with their rotted mattresses. Mason laid Emma on the least damaged one and quickly built a fire with wood stacked beside the hearth. As flames caught and grew, the small space began to warm slightly. Emma's eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. Mason removed his gloves and chafed her hands between his, trying to restore circulation. "Emma," he said firmly, "open your eyes. Look at me." Her eyelids fluttered, then opened. "Cold," she managed. "I know, but you need to stay awake a little longer." Mason continued, rubbing her hands and her arms. "Early stages of hypothermia. Your body temperature has dropped too low." Robert entered, bringing with him a blast of cold air and snow before he forced the door closed again. He carried their saddlebags and the precious box of evidence, which he set carefully on the table. "Horses are in the lean-to out back," he reported. "Storm's getting worse. We're not going anywhere for a while." Mason nodded, his attention still focused on Emma. "We need to get her warm. Blankets, anything you can find." Together they collected what meager bedding the cabin offered, supplementing it with their own coats and the horse blankets Robert retrieved from the lean-to. Mason wrapped Emma in layers, then built up the fire as high as safety permitted. "Drink this," he urged, holding a flask of whiskey Mrs. Peterson had included with their supplies. "Just a small sip. It will help warm you from inside." Emma complied, coughing slightly as the liquor burned its way down her throat. Some color returned to her cheeks, a promising sign. "Better," Mason said approvingly. "Now try to eat something." Robert prepared a simple meal from their provisions, hard bread softened near the fire, dried meat, a precious apple that Sarah had packed. They ate in silence, the storm raging outside, transforming the day into a strange twilight. "How long do these storms usually last?" Mason asked when they'd finished eating. Robert shrugged. "A day, maybe two this time of year. We've got food enough, and I can bring in more wood from the lean-to." Mason glanced at Emma, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her color improved but still pale. "She needs rest more than anything. The journeys have been hard on her." "She's tougher than she looks," Robert observed. "Has to be to survive what they did to her." Mason nodded, his gaze still on Emma's sleeping form. "Do you know what happened to her father? The real story, not what Holcroft told the town?" Robert's expression darkened. "My pa had suspicions. Said Dr. Blackwood came to him the week before he died, talking about water samples and poison. Pa didn't take it seriously enough at the time. After the doctor was found hanging, Pa started asking questions. Next thing we knew, our cattle were getting sick, our crops failing. He stoked the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Pa wanted to go to the territorial authorities, but Ma was afraid. Then Pa got sick, wasting disease, the kind that takes you slowly. By the time he died, we'd lost nearly everything, including the will to fight back. Until now," Mason noted. Robert met his gaze steadily. "Until Emma came back from the dead and you with her. Seemed like a sign that maybe it wasn't too late to do the right thing." The storm continued through the day and into the night, howling around the cabin like a living thing. They took turns sleeping and keeping watch, though there was little danger of pursuit in such weather. Emma woke fully in the evening, stronger after her rest. She sat wrapped in blankets by the fire, examining her father's notebooks, while Mason prepared a broth from their supplies. "Look at this," she said, pointing to an entry. "My father identified the exact location where Holcroft was introducing the arsenic, a narrow point in the creek just below where it branches toward town. The poison flowed only to the farms, not to Redemption itself." Mason looked over his shoulder at the careful diagrams. "Your father was thorough. This will be compelling evidence." "If we reach Laramie," Emma said softly. "We will." Mason handed her the cup of broth. "The storm will pass. We'll complete the journey. Holcroft will answer for his crimes." Emma sipped the warm liquid, her eyes holding his over the rim of the cup. "And then what, Mason? What happens after justice is done?" The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on the immediate goal, getting Emma and the evidence safely to Laramie, that he hadn't considered what might follow. "I don't know," he admitted. "I suppose you'll be free to start over. Perhaps study medicine as your father wanted." "And you," her gaze was direct, challenging, "will you return to your cabin, resume your solitude?" Mason looked into the fire, watching the flames dance and curl. The thought of returning to his isolated existence after everything that had happened felt strangely hollow. "I'm not sure that's possible anymore," he said finally. "Some doors once opened can't be closed again." Emma nodded, understanding what he didn't explicitly say. "My father had a saying, God brings people into our lives for a reason, a season, or a lifetime. The trick is figuring out which it is." Before Mason could respond, Robert, who had been dozing on one of the bunks, sat up suddenly. "Listen," he said. They fell silent. The wind had died down, the howling storm replaced by a profound stillness that seemed almost unnatural after the previous chaos. "Storms passed," Robert confirmed, moving to the cabin's single window. Frost coated the inside of the glass, but when he scraped it away with a knife, moonlight streamed in. "Sky's clear. We can move on before dawn." Mason glanced at Emma, evaluating her condition. "Are you strong enough?" She nodded firmly. "I've come too far to stop now." They rested a few more hours, then prepared to depart while night still held sway. The world outside the cabin had been transformed by the storm. Familiar contours buried under feet of fresh snow, trees bowed under white burdens, the trail completely obliterated. "I can find the way," Robert assured them, adjusting the cinches on the horses. "But we'll need to move carefully. Avalanche risk is high after a storm like that." They set out under a brilliant canopy of stars, the air so cold it hurt to inhale deeply. The horses plunged through snow that sometimes reached their bellies, making progress slow and laborious. But they were heading downhill now, each step taking them closer to Laramie and the justice they sought. As the eastern sky began to lighten, revealing a landscape scoured clean by the storm, Mason felt a cautious hope rise within him. They had survived burial, pursuit, and blizzard. Perhaps they would succeed after all. That hope was shattered by the sound of a rifle shot echoing across the valley below. Down, Mason shouted, reaching for Emma even as he scanned the slopes around them. Where did that come from? Robert pointed to a ridge about a quarter-mile ahead. There. Riders. Through the crystal-clear air, Mason could see them now. 3 men on horseback positioned to intercept the trail where it descended into the valley. One held a rifle pointed skyward, having fired the warning shot. It's Davis, Robert said grimly. Holcroft's man. They must have circled around during the storm, guessed we'd use this route. Mason assessed their options, none of them good. Behind lay the difficult terrain they'd just traversed, offering no easy escape. To either side, steep slopes made passage nearly impossible, especially with horses. Ahead, the only practical route forward was directly into the ambush. We could wait them out, Robert suggested. They'll have to move eventually. Mason shook his head. They have supplies fresh horses. We're already low on food and Emma needs proper shelter soon. He studied the terrain again, eyes narrowing. There's another way. Emma followed his gaze to a narrow ravine cutting across the slope to their right. Through there, the horses would never make it. Not the horses, no. Mason's expression was grim but determined. But we could on foot. It would bring us out behind them, give us the advantage of surprise. Robert considered the plan. It could work. I'll create a distraction, make them think we're all still here. You two go through the ravine circle around. It's too dangerous, Emma protested. If they realize what we're doing, it's our best chance, Mason interrupted gently. Robert can lead them away from the ravine. Give us time to get into position. Emma looked from Mason to Robert, then nodded reluctantly. The evidence box. Bring it, Mason said. We can't risk leaving it. They dismounted, keeping low to avoid being seen. Robert took the reins of all 3 horses. I'll head back up the trail, then cut east when I'm out of sight. Make them think we're trying to find another way down. With luck, they'll follow me long enough for you to get behind them. Mason clasped the younger man's hand. Thank you for everything. Robert managed a tight smile. Just make where Holcroft pays for what he did to this valley. To all of us. He mounted and rode away, leading the other 2 horses. Mason and Emma waited until he was safely out of sight, then turned toward the ravine. Stay close, Mason instructed, rifle ready. The footing will be treacherous. The ravine was even narrower than it had appeared from a distance, barely wide enough for a person in some places, with steep, icy walls rising on either side. They moved as quickly as caution allowed, Emma carrying the precious evidence box secured to her back, Mason leading the way. The sound of another rifle shot echoed from behind them. Robert's distraction working. Shouts followed too distant to make out the words, but the meaning was clear. The pursuers had spotted him and given chase. Hurry, Mason urged, though he knew Emma was already moving as fast as her recovering body permitted. The ravine twisted and turned, sometimes requiring them to slide down icy chutes or climb over fallen trees. Their breath clouded before them, hands numbing despite gloves. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that this might be their only chance to bring Holcroft to justice. Finally, the ravine widened, spilling them out onto a broader slope. Mason oriented himself, quickly identifying the ridge where they'd spotted the ambush. This way, he said, pointing uphill. If we can reach that cluster of pines, we'll have cover and a clear view of the trail. They struggled upward through deep snow, the thin mountain air burning in their lungs. Emma stumbled, once fatigue evident in her movements, but recovered before Mason could help her. Her determination never wavered, not even when the steep climb left her gasping for breath. The pines, when they reached them, provided both cover and a commanding view of the valley below. Mason could see the trail where it wound down from the higher elevations, currently empty of riders, no sign of Robert or his pursuers. Now what? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We wait, Mason replied, and when they return, we'll be ready. They didn't wait long. Within half an hour, riders appeared on the trail below. First Robert on his sturdy mountain pony, then 2 men in pursuit. Davis and another of Holcroft's men, both intent on their quarry. Where's the third? Emma murmured, scanning the landscape. Mason had noticed the same discrepancy. I don't know, stay alert. Robert was leading his pursuers on a skillful chase, using his knowledge of the terrain to maintain distance without losing them completely. He was heading back toward the main trail, leading them directly below Mason and Emma's position. Get ready, Mason said, raising his rifle. When they pass beneath us, I'll take Davis. You stay down until it's over. Emma nodded, though her hand moved to the small revolver Robert had given her before they separated, a last resort if things went badly. The riders drew nearer, hooves kicking up plumes of snow. Robert was perhaps 50 yards ahead of his pursuers, his horse showing signs of fatigue. Davis raised his rifle, aiming at the fleeing figure. Mason took careful aim and fired. The shot caught Davis in the shoulder, spinning him in his saddle. He dropped his rifle, clutching at the wound. His companion reined in sharply, head swiveling, to locate the source of the attack. Mason chambered another round and fired again, deliberately sending this shot just over the second rider's head. The man needed no further encouragement. He wheeled his horse and galloped back the way they had come, leaving the injured Davis behind. Robert, hearing the shots, circled back cautiously. When he saw Mason and Emma emerging from the trees, he grinned with relief. Davis, still mounted but clearly in pain, watched their approach with wary eyes. Blood stained the sleeve of his coat, but the wound wasn't life-threatening. "Where's Holcroft?" Mason demanded, keeping his rifle trained on the injured man. Davis spat into the snow. "Waiting for you in Laramie Dock, with more men than you can handle." Emma stepped forward, her expression hard. "And Father Jeremiah, is he part of this ambush too?" Something flickered in Davis's eyes, surprise perhaps, or unease. "The preacher stayed in town. Said he wanted no part in bloodshed." "Interesting," Mason murmured. "A man of God drawing the line at murder, if not at burial alive." Robert, who had dismounted to retrieve Davis's fallen rifle, looked to Mason for direction. "What do we do with him?" Mason considered their options. "We can't take him with us to Laramie, and we can't leave him here to freeze." "Send him back to Redemption," Emma suggested. "By the time he reaches town and they organize another pursuit, we'll be in Laramie." Mason nodded. It was the most merciful option, and mercy, he'd come to believe, was not a weakness, but a choice, one that separated men like him from men like Holcroft. "You heard the lady," he told Davis. "Ride back to town. Tell Holcroft we're coming for him, with enough evidence to hang him 10 times over." Davis's expression darkened with hatred, but with one arm useless and facing 3 determined opponents, he had little choice. He turned his horse and rode away, hunched in the saddle, a solitary figure soon swallowed by the vastness of the snow-covered landscape. Robert retrieved the horses he'd been leading, which had stopped some distance away when the shooting started. "We should move quickly," he advised. "There's still the third rider unaccounted for." They mounted and continued down the trail, alert for any sign of the missing ambusher. The day had warmed slightly, the sun transforming the snow-covered valley into a blinding white expanse, broken only by stands of dark pine and the occasional rocky outcropping. "If we push hard, we can reach Laramie by nightfall," Robert said, pointing to where the trail disappeared into a distant forest. "Once we're in the trees, the going will be easier." Mason glanced at Emma, concerned by the pallor of her face. The exertion of their escape through the ravine had clearly cost her, though she made no complaint. "We'll take it steadily," he said. "No point arriving if we're too exhausted to state our case." They rode in single file, Robert leading the way. Emma in the middle, Mason bringing up the rear. The sun climbed higher, its heat beginning to melt the surface of the snow, creating a treacherous crust that broke unpredictably beneath the horses' hooves. They had nearly reached the forest edge when a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up snow just ahead of Robert's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. "The trees!" Mason shouted, identifying the source of the attack, a sniper positioned at the forest's edge. "Get to cover." They spurred their horses forward, racing for the protection of the pines. More shots followed, alarmingly accurate despite the distance. The third ambusher evidently was a marksman of considerable skill. They reached the trees without injury, the dense pines providing immediate shelter from the sniper's aim. Robert led them deeper into the forest, following what appeared to be a game trail rather than the main route. "Old hunting path," he explained, "circles around and joins the main trail further down. He can't cover both." Mason nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking." They pushed on through the forest, the snow less deep beneath the canopy of pines. The horses moved more easily here, picking their way carefully among the trees. No more shots came, suggesting their detour had successfully evaded the sniper. "We're close now," Robert said as the afternoon waned. 2 hours to Laramie, maybe less." Emma, who had been silent for much of the journey, suddenly swayed in her saddle. Mason moved his horse alongside hers, just in time to steady her. "I'm fine," she insisted, though her face was alarmingly pale. "Just tired." Mason could see it was more than fatigue, the combination of her recent trauma, The difficult journey and the cold had pushed her body to its limits. We'll rest here briefly, he decided, just long enough to eat something and recover our strength. Robert looked concerned but nodded, guiding them to a small clearing sheltered from the wind. They dismounted Mason, helping Emma to a fallen log where she could sit. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders despite her protests. Eat, he instructed, unwrapping bread and dried meat from their provisions. You need the strength. Emma complied, though each movement seemed to require conscious effort. I won't be the reason we fail, she said between bites, not when we're so close. You've already endured more than anyone should have to, Mason replied. Resting for a few minutes won't change the outcome. The short break helped. Color returned to Emma's cheeks, and when they remounted to continue the journey, she sat straighter in the saddle, determination once again evident in the set of her jaw. The forest thinned as they descended into broader, more hospitable terrain. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and rose, when they crested a final rise and saw Laramie spread before them in the valley below. It was larger than Redemption, a proper town with multiple streets, substantial buildings, and the unmistakable signs of law and order, a courthouse, a jail, a territorial office flying the American flag. We made it, Emma breathed, relief evident in her voice. Mason wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Holcroft said he'd be waiting for us here, with men. Robert nodded grimly. We'll need to be careful. Go directly to the marshal, no stops. They descended toward town, alert for any sign of ambush. The streets were relatively quiet in the early evening, a few townspeople hurrying home for supper, a saloon already doing brisk business. Nothing immediately threatening. The marshal's office was located near the courthouse, a sturdy building with light showing in its windows. They approached cautiously, Mason scanning the street and surrounding buildings for any sign of Holcroft or his men. I'll go in first, he decided. Robert, stay with Emma. If there's trouble, ride hard and don't look back. Emma caught his arm. We do this together, she insisted. All of us or none? Mason saw the determination in her eyes and knew argument would be futile. He nodded once, accepting her decision. They dismounted and approached the marshal's office, the evidence box clutched tightly in Emma's arms. Mason opened the door, ushering Emma and Robert inside ahead of him. The office was warm and well lit, with a desk, several chairs, and wanted posters adorning the walls. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s, gray-streaked hair and a substantial mustache, lending him a distinguished air. He looked up as they entered, surprise evident in his expression. Can I help you folks? He asked, rising from his chair. Marshal, Mason began. I'm Dr. Mason Caldwell. This is Miss Emma Blackwood and Mr. Robert Peterson. We've come from Redemption with evidence of serious crimes committed by the town's mayor, Silas Holcroft. The marshal's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. Holcroft, you say? That's interesting timing. He's here in Laramie right now, lodged a complaint this very morning about fugitives from justice heading this way. Mason tensed, sensing a trap. Whatever he told you, Marshal, it's a lie. We have proof. The door behind them opened, cutting off Mason's words. He turned, already reaching for his revolver, expecting to find Holcroft and his men. Instead, Father Jeremiah stood in the doorway, snow-dusting his black coat, his clerical collar stark white against the dark fabric. Dr. Caldwell, the clergyman said, his reedy voice strangely calm. Miss Blackwood, I've been expecting you. Mason's hand remained near his weapon. You've come to stop us. Jeremiah shook his head slowly. No, doctor. I've come to join you. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather-bound book, with my own evidence against Silas Holcroft. The marshal's office seemed suddenly too small for the tension it contained. Mason stared at Father Jeremiah, trying to reconcile this unexpected development with everything he knew about the man. Your evidence? Emma asked, disbelief evident in her tone. You were part of it all, the trial, the sentence. You watched them bury me alive and did nothing. Jeremiah's face betrayed genuine remorse. Yes, a sin I will carry to my grave and beyond. He turned to the marshal, who was watching the exchange with careful attention. Marshal Thompson, I've come to confess my role in crimes committed in Redemption and to testify against Silas Holcroft. The marshal's gaze moved from Jeremiah to Mason and his companions, assessing. Seems I've got quite a situation on my hands. Why don't you all sit down and tell me exactly what's going on, one at a time? They arranged themselves around the marshal's office. Emma and Mason, side by side, Robert standing protectively near the door, Jeremiah apart from the others, his head slightly bowed. Emma placed her father's evidence box on the marshal's desk. This contains water samples and detailed notes proving that Silas Holcroft has been systematically poisoning the water supply to outlying farms in Redemption Valley. My father, Dr. Samuel Blackwood, discovered this before his death, a death that was murder, not suicide, as Holcroft claimed. Marshal Thompson opened the box, examining its contents with careful attention. Arsenic poisoning, he read from one of the notebooks. Deliberate contamination at the watershed junction. He looked up at Emma. Serious allegations, Miss Blackwood. True ones, Emma stated firmly. My father threatened to expose Holcroft and days later was found hanging from the church bell tower. When I continued his investigation, Holcroft and his men held a sham trial, convicted me of witchcraft, and buried me alive. The marshal's expression hardened. Buried alive, that's not just murder, that's torture. She would have died, Mason interjected, if I hadn't found her by chance and dug her out. Marshal Thompson's gaze shifted to him. And you are Mason Caldwell, former Army surgeon now. He hesitated. Now a man trying to see justice done. Dr. Caldwell saved my life, Emma said simply, and has risked his own to help me bring this evidence to you. The marshal nodded thoughtfully, then turned to Father Jeremiah. And your part in this, Reverend Jeremiah opened the small book he carried, a journal, Mason realized. I have recorded here dates, times, and details of meetings where Holcroft discussed his plans, including his confession to me in confidence that he arranged Dr. Blackwood's death to appear as suicide. You knew, Emma's voice cracked with emotion, you knew he murdered my father and still you condemned me. Jeremiah couldn't meet her eyes. Fear is a powerful master, Miss Blackwood. Holcroft holds the town in his grip through intimidation and selective violence. I told myself I was protecting my flock by cooperating. His shoulders sagged with the weight of his confession. I was a coward. What changed? Mason asked, genuinely curious. You did, Doctor. Jeremiah finally looked up. When I recognized you that day at your cabin, I remembered Gettysburg. I was there when Dr. Thomas Blackwood died on your operating table, not from any failure of yours, but because he worked himself to exhaustion, saving others. He turned to Emma. Your grandfather was a great man, Miss Blackwood, and in that moment, seeing his granddaughter risen from the grave alongside the very surgeon who tried to save him, it felt like divine intervention. A second chance to choose rightly where once I chose wrongly. The office fell silent as they absorbed his words. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the windows. Marshal Thompson cleared his throat. Where is Holcroft now? The Grand Hotel, Jeremiah replied, with 3 armed men. He plans to intercept Dr. Caldwell and Miss Blackwood when they arrive, prevent them from reaching you. Too late for that, the marshal observed dryly. He stood adjusting the badge on his chest. I believe I have enough evidence to arrest Silas Holcroft on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and criminal poisoning. He moved to a gun cabinet, unlocking it and removing a shotgun. But I'll need deputies for this. Holcroft won't come quietly. I'll help, Robert volunteered immediately. The marshal assessed the young man, then nodded. And you, Dr. Caldwell? Mason glanced at Emma, torn between staying to protect her and helping to apprehend the man who had nearly killed her. She made the decision for him. Go, she said softly. Finish this. Jeremiah stepped forward. I'll stay with Miss Blackwood. It's the least I can do. Mason hesitated, then nodded. We'll be back soon. The marshal deputized them quickly, then led Mason and Robert out into the snowy evening. They moved purposefully toward the Grand Hotel, the most imposing building in Laramie, its windows blazing with light against the gathering darkness. Remember, Marshal Thompson instructed as they approached. Holcroft is dangerous because he believes himself righteous. Men like that don't surrender easily. The hotel lobby was warm and well-appointed, a stark contrast to the wilderness they had traveled through. The clerk behind the desk looked up in surprise as 3 armed men entered. Marshal Thompson, he greeted nervously. How may I assist you? Silas Holcroft, the marshal replied. Which room? Suite 3, sir. Top floor. The clerk's eyes widened as he noted their grim expressions and ready weapons. Is there trouble? The marshal didn't answer, already heading for the stairs with Mason and Robert close behind. They ascended quietly, avoiding the creaking steps. At the top floor, Marshal Thompson signaled for them to spread out. Two men stood outside Suite 3, alert and armed. The marshal stepped into view, shotgun raised. "Gentlemen," he called, "I'm placing Silas Holcroft under arrest. Step aside." The guards exchanged glances, hands moving toward their weapons. Mason and Robert emerged from cover, rifles aimed. "Don't," Mason advised coldly. "It won't end well for you." One of the guards, a young man with nervous eyes, raised his hand slowly. The other, older and harder looking, hesitated a moment longer before following suit. Marshal Thompson nodded to Robert, who quickly disarmed the guards. "Wise choice," the marshal told them. "Now is Holcroft inside?" "Yes, sir," the younger guard answered. "With Davis. He's wounded." The marshal tried the door, found it locked. "Holcroft," he called. "This is Marshal Thompson. Open up." Silence from within, then a cultured voice. "What seems to be the problem, Marshal?" "You're under arrest, Holcroft. Multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Open this door or we'll break it down." A pause, then the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door swung open to reveal Silas Holcroft, impeccably dressed despite the journey, his expression one of injured innocence. "Marshal, there must be some misunderstanding. I'm here on legitimate business." "Save it for the judge," Thompson interrupted. He entered the suite, shotgun still ready. Davis sat slumped in a chair, his shoulder bandaged, his face pale with pain and fear. He made no move to resist as Robert secured his hands behind his back. Holcroft maintained his composure, though Mason could see calculation in those cold blue eyes, constantly assessing, looking for advantage. "You're making a grave mistake, Marshal. I am a respected community leader, a man of business and progress." "And a murderer," Mason added flatly. "Emma Blackwood is alive, Holcroft. Your attempt to silence her failed." Something flickered in Holcroft's expression, genuine surprise quickly masked. "Dr. Caldwell, you have allowed yourself to be deceived by a disturbed young woman. Miss Blackwood was tried and sentenced according to the laws of redemption." "Burial alive isn't law, it's torture," the marshal growled, disgusted. "And we have evidence of your other crimes, the poisoned water, Dr. Blackwood's murder." Holcroft's mask of civility slipped further. "Evidence? What evidence could possibly—" He stopped, realization dawning. "Jeremiah. That sanctimonious coward betrayed me. He chose redemption over damnation," Mason corrected. "Something you might consider." The marshal moved forward with handcuffs. "Silas Holcroft, you're under arrest for the murder of Samuel Blackwood, the attempted murder of Emma Blackwood, criminal poisoning, and whatever else I find when I start digging deeper." For a moment it seemed Holcroft would submit. Then with shocking speed for a man his age, he lunged toward a desk drawer, reaching inside. Mason reacted instinctively, tackling Holcroft before his hand could close around whatever weapon lay hidden there. They crashed to the floor, Holcroft fighting with the desperation of a man who knew his life was forfeit. "It was mine," Holcroft snarled, his cultured veneer completely gone. "The silver, the land, all of it, those fools didn't deserve. It couldn't see its value." Mason pinned him, disgusted by the madness in the man's eyes. "And that justified murder, torture. Progress requires sacrifice." Holcroft spat. "I was building something greater than any of you could imagine." The marshal pulled Mason off, securing Holcroft with handcuffs despite his continued struggles. "You'll have plenty of time to contemplate your progress while you're waiting for the hangman," Thompson told him grimly. They led Holcroft and Davis out of the hotel and through the snowy streets to the jail, a crowd gathering as word spread of the arrests. By the time they reached the marshal's office, it seemed half of Laramie was following, curious about the drama unfolding in their quiet town. Emma and Jeremiah looked up as they entered, Holcroft between them in chains. Emma's face showed no triumph, only a profound relief that Mason understood completely. The nightmare that had begun with her burial was finally approaching its end. Holcroft's gaze fixed on Emma, hatred burning in his eyes. "You should have died in that hole," he snarled, "just like your father should have died at the end of that rope." "But she didn't," Mason said, stepping between them. "And now you'll face justice for what you've done. Real justice, not the perversion you created in redemption." Marshal Thompson locked Holcroft and Davis in cells at the back of the office, then returned to address the others. "I'll need formal statements from all of you. Then the territorial judge will handle the rest. He's due in Laramie next week for circuit court." Emma nodded wearily. The strain of the journey and the confrontation had clearly taken its toll. What happens to redemption now? She asked. The town will need new leadership, the marshal said. Someone who can help heal the damage Holcroft has done. Father Jeremiah cleared his throat. I would like to return if I may, to make amends to help rebuild. It won't erase my sins, but perhaps it can be a start. The marshal nodded thoughtfully. That will be for the townspeople to decide. But testimony like yours helping bring Holcroft to justice counts for something. As the details were arranged, Mason moved to Emma's side. It's over, he said quietly. You've done it. Your father would be proud. Emma leaned against him slightly, allowing herself to show weakness now that the immediate danger had passed. We've done it, she corrected. I couldn't have managed without you, Mason. The marshal arranged rooms for them at a respectable boarding house, insisting they stay in Laramie until the judge arrived and preliminary hearings could be held. After formal statements were taken, they finally left the office, stepping into a night now thick with gently falling snow. Robert bid them goodbye, eager to return to Redemption with news of Holcroft's arrest. People need to know, he explained, need to understand they're free of him. Jeremiah departed with him, his demeanor that of a man beginning a long journey of atonement. He paused before Emma, his expression humble. I cannot ask for forgiveness, Miss Blackwood. What I did and failed to do is unforgivable. But I will spend whatever years remain to me trying to make redemption worthy of its name. Emma regarded him steadily. My father believed redemption was possible for anyone truly seeking it. I hope he was right. The boarding house was a welcome haven after their ordeal, clean warm with hot food and soft beds. After eating their fill for the first time in days, Emma and Mason found themselves alone in the small parlor, a fire crackling in the grate. What will you do now? Mason asked, echoing her earlier question to him. Will you return to redemption? Emma stared into the flames, considering. I'm not sure there's anything left for me there. Too many memories, too much pain. She looked up at him. But I've been thinking about what my father wanted for me, medical training. Perhaps I could still pursue that. Mason nodded approvingly. You have the aptitude, certainly, and the compassion. And you, Emma's gaze was direct, challenging. Will you go back to your cabin, your solitude? The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Mason thought of his isolated existence before Emma had literally risen from the earth into his life. The peace he'd sought had been hollow, he realized now. Not healing merely absence of pain, yes, but also of purpose, of connection. I think perhaps, he said slowly, it's time for a new chapter. Time to practice medicine again, to use what skills I have to help others. Emma's expression softened. I think Mary would approve of that decision. As would your father, I imagine. Mason hesitated, then continued. There's talk of Laramie needing another doctor. The town's growing rapidly with the railway coming through. Is that an invitation, Dr. Caldwell? Emma asked, a smile touching her lips for the first time in days. Perhaps it is Miss Blackwood. Mason returned her smile, feeling something long dormant stirring within him, hope, possibility, future. We make a good team, after all. Doctor and nurse. For now, Emma agreed, until I can be Dr. Blackwood in my own right. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering Laramie in a clean white blanket, nature's way of starting fresh. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, two people who had survived burial, one literal, one figurative, contemplated a path forward together. Not all wounds were healed. Some would leave scars that would never fully fade. But as Mason reached across the space between them to take Emma's hand in his, he knew with certainty that life, like the three-legged doe they'd saved, could find new ways to thrive, even after the most grievous injury. To new beginnings, he said softly, squeezing her fingers gently. Emma's answering smile held all the warmth of spring after the longest winter. To resurrection, she replied, and the price we pay for it. In the jail at the marshal's office, Holcroft raged against his fate, all pretense of civilization stripped away. In the boarding house parlor, Mason and Emma sat in companionable silence, watching flames dance in the hearth, two souls finding in each other the redemption they'd thought forever beyond reach. Outside, the world lay hushed beneath new fallen snow, the promise of tomorrow waiting to be written on its pristine surface.